Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. I'm Robert, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they are essential to help the channel grow and allow me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The evening of July 5th, 2024, settled over the red brick terraces of Geneva Road in Darlington like a soft, familiar blanket. Inside one of these homes, the air was thick with the comforting aroma of spaghetti bolognese simmering on the stove, a scent that promised the simple, unshakable rhythm of family life. Sarah Hall stood at the counter, stirring the rich red sauce, the gentle clatter of her wooden spoon against the pot creating a steady heartbeat in the warm kitchen. Laughter, light and easy, spilled from the living room where her partner of 27 years, Simon Vickers, was watching a Euros football match on television. He had a glass of wine in his hand, his fourth by his own admission, and the day's earlier haze of cannabis had softened the edges of the world into a pleasant blur. Their daughter Scarlett, just 14, was a whirlwind of youthful energy. Her presence filled the small house with vibrant, irrepressible light. She was, as her father would later describe her, a fantastic daughter, a description that felt both deeply true and, in retrospect, tragically inadequate. She stood on the cusp of womanhood, an incredible young woman in the making, her mother thought, watching her flit around the kitchen with eyes sparkling with mischief. She was the center of their universe, the only child of a long and settled partnership, a bright star in the quiet constellation of their lives. The mood was buoyant, tinged with the casual joy of a Friday night. The football match provided a low, exciting thrum in the background, but the real game was happening in the kitchen. It started innocuously, as such things often do. Scarlett, with a playful grin, picked up a grape from a bowl on the counter and tossed it at her father. It bounced harmlessly off his shoulder. Simon, laughing, retaliated. For a few brief, sunlit moments, the air filled with flying grapes and peals of laughter. It was a scene of domestic bliss, a snapshot of a family at ease, their love expressed in a language of gentle teasing and shared silliness. Sarah, caught up in the spirit, grabbed a pair of kitchen tongs and playfully snipped them at Simon. He feigned injury, clutching his arm with theatrical groaning. "Ow!" he exclaimed, a smile playing on his lips. Scarlett, ever her father's witty foil, chimed in with mockery in her voice, calling him wimpy. The play fight escalated, a harmless dance of affection and gesturing. In that moment, they were a happy family cocooned in the safety of their home, unaware that they were standing on the precipice of an abyss. Sarah turned her back for a moment, her attention shifting to the stove, ready to serve the meal she had so lovingly prepared. The laughter was still echoing in her ears when it was pierced by a sound that didn't belong, a small sound, almost lost in the domestic symphony. "Ow!" It was Scarlett's voice, but the playful tone was gone, replaced by a note of sharp, genuine surprise. Sarah spun around. The scene that met her eyes would be seared into her memory, a waking nightmare from which she would never truly escape. The laughter had died. The playful energy had vanished, replaced by a sudden, chilling stillness. Scarlett was standing near the back door, her hand pressed to her chest, and from between her fingers, a torrent of blood was pouring. A shocking, impossible river of crimson that stained her pajama top and pooled at her feet. Panic, cold and absolute, seized the room. Simon's face became a mask of confusion, his earlier intoxication evaporating in a rush of adrenaline and horror. The last thing Scarlett must have seen, Sarah would later reflect, was the panic on their faces. Sarah's world narrowed to a single desperate focus, her daughter, bleeding, faltering. She lunged for the phone, her fingers fumbling with the keypad, her voice a strangled plea to the 999 operator. "We were messing about," she gasped into the receiver, the words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed stream. "He's thrown something at her." The arrival of the ambulance felt like an eternity, though in reality, the paramedics were on the scene within minutes. They swarmed the kitchen, their calm professionalism a stark contrast to the chaotic terror that had engulfed the family. They worked desperately to save Scarlett, their movements swift and precise, but the damage was too catastrophic. A single deep wound to her chest had severed her life at its root. Shortly after the paramedics, police officers arrived, their presence casting a formal, somber pall over the scene. Police Sergeant Sarah Thompson entered the house to find the paramedics performing CPR on Scarlett's lifeless body. Simon and Sarah stood huddled in the doorway of the kitchen, their faces etched with dawning, unbearable grief. P.S. Thompson noted that Simon was heavily intoxicated, his speech slurred, a strong smell of alcohol clinging to him. When she asked what had happened, he mumbled, "We were mucking about." The officers separated them, taking them to different police stations. The protocol kicked in with grim efficiency, a potential homicide scene. Both Simon Vickers and Sarah Hall found themselves arrested on suspicion of attempted murder. It was within the cold, unforgiving walls of a police cell that Sarah received the devastating news about her daughter. Scarlett had been pronounced dead at 11:50 p.m. The news completely shattered her world. Her anguished cries rang through the station, a raw, heartbreaking sound of pure loss. "No, please, my girl." Overwhelmed by crushing grief, she had to be sedated, drifting between consciousness and darkness, each awakening bringing fresh waves of unbearable pain. The investigation began beneath the harsh, unforgiving lights of the police station. For the detectives of Durham Police, this case presented a deeply confusing and disturbing puzzle. A 14-year-old girl lay dead, killed in her own kitchen with only her parents as witnesses. The initial accounts were muddled and contradictory. At first, both Simon and his partner claimed they had no idea how Scarlett had been injured. Then their story began to shift. It was a play fight, they said, and an accident. In his initial police interview, Simon Vickers insisted the incident was a tragic mistake. He stuck to this story, but the details started unraveling at the edges. His account kept changing. He said they were all happily playing around together. He claimed he'd thrown a pair of tongs at his daughter, just part of their game. But then, faced with the reality of a knife wound, his story transformed once again. He admitted he'd thrown a knife, but insisted he'd mistaken it for something else. A spatula, perhaps, or maybe the tongs. He was surprised, he said, when he saw his daughter bleeding. The detectives remained skeptical. This claim of accidentally throwing the knife seemed far-fetched, but it was the physical evidence that would ultimately tear his story apart. While Simon painted a picture of a freak accident born from playful chaos, neighbors reported hearing a loud argument coming from the Vickers home just before the emergency call. This single detail cast a dark shadow over Simon's version of events, suggesting the atmosphere in that kitchen may not have been as lighthearted as he claimed. The inconsistencies in his statements, combined with the neighbors' reports, began constructing a far more sinister narrative. The playful fight was starting to look less like a game and more like a cover for something terrible. The heart of the prosecution's case wouldn't be built on motive or character, but on the cold, undeniable language of science. The key to unlocking the truth of what happened in the Vickers kitchen lay in Scarlett's post-mortem examination and the expert testimony of Home Office forensic pathologist, Dr. Jennifer Bolton. Her findings would systematically dismantle Simon Vickers' defense, piece by painful piece. Dr. Bolton presented her evidence to Tesside Crown Court with calm, methodical clarity that stood in stark contrast to the emotional turmoil surrounding the case. She explained that Scarlett had died from a single wound to the chest. The knife had penetrated to a depth of approximately 11 centimeters, just over 4 inches. The blade had passed between 2 of her ribs, punctured her lung, and critically pierced her heart. The resulting blood loss into her chest cavity was catastrophic and would have caused her to lose consciousness within minutes. The defense, led by Nicholas Lumley, KC, hinged entirely on the premise of an accident. Vickers claimed he had either thrown the knife by mistake, thinking it was a toy, or had been holding it while playfully swiping along the work surface, not realizing Scarlett was in the way. Dr. Bolton addressed the throw knife theory first, and her conclusion was crystal clear. It was, she stated, virtually impossible. She explained to the jury that kitchen knives simply aren't designed for throwing. They're not balanced for flight. For a thrown knife to penetrate clothing, in Scarlett's case her pajama top, and then enter the chest to such a depth, it would have to strike at a perfect 90-degree angle. Any other angle, and the blade would have glanced off, bounced away, or caused a much more superficial cut. The probability of such a perfect accidental strike was infinitesimally small. The wound Scarlett sustained was not consistent with a tumbling, randomly thrown object. This left the second possibility that Vickers had been holding the knife. He claimed he might have been swiping it along the worktop in a playful gesture. But again, the pathology told a different story. The wound was located in a part of the chest that's naturally protected by the arm. To inflict such an injury, the attacker must have been very close to the victim. Furthermore, Dr. Bolton concluded that the knife must have been held firmly and tightly in Vickers' hand at the moment of impact. While the actual force required to penetrate the chest and heart might have been light, the act itself was not a clumsy accidental swipe. It was a directed motion. The knife was not a passive object in a chaotic accident. It was a weapon wielded with purpose. Under cross-examination, Mr. Lumley pressed Dr. Bolton harder on the possibility of an accident. Could a sudden movement have caused this? Maybe Scarlett lunged forward during their playful struggle? Dr. Bolton acknowledged that anything was possible in theory, but the evidence told a very different story. The wound itself spoke volumes. Its depth, its angle, the precise location, everything pointed toward deliberate action, not some tragic mishap the defense was trying to paint. In a moment that cut straight to the heart of the matter, she delivered devastating testimony. Had the knife struck just a millimeter or two to either side, Scarlett might have lived. But it hadn't. It found her heart with chilling accuracy that made the accident theory crumble under scrutiny. The prosecution, led by Senior Crown Prosecutor Anna Barker, hammered home their case. Mr. Vickers' story simply didn't match what the science revealed. The forensic evidence had torn apart the playful struggle narrative, exposing it as pure fiction. Gone was the tragic image of a father accidentally harming his daughter during a moment of innocent fun. In its place stood something far more sinister, a father, intoxicated and possibly enraged, driving a knife into his child's chest. The trial of Simon Vickers at Teesside Crown Court became a stage for unimaginable tragedy. At its heart sat 2 grieving parents, their world destroyed, now forced into opposing corners by the merciless machinery of justice. Yet, in a twist that stunned observers, they weren't enemies at all. Sarah Hall, mother of the murdered girl, stood firmly beside her partner of 27 years, the very man accused of taking their daughter's life. Her testimony became one of the trial's most heartbreaking moments. When she took the stand, grief radiated from every word. Here was a mother who had lost her only child, but she didn't come seeking vengeance. She told the jury that Simon adored Scarlett. He would never, could never, have hurt her intentionally. She painted a picture of their happy family life, describing that terrible night as a tragic accident that spiraled beyond anyone's control. She backed up every detail of his story. The playful struggle, the grapes, the tongs, the laughter that turned to horror. Her loyalty never wavered. Her belief in Simon's innocence remained absolute. She had become, in essence, the defense's star witness. Simon Vickers himself took the stand to proclaim his innocence. He denied both murder and manslaughter charges outright. He walked the jury through that evening, the football match, the wine, the family time together. He presented himself as a devoted father trapped in an unthinkable nightmare. His final account claimed he had swept what he believed were tongs across the counter and into Scarlett's chest, only realizing too late that he held a knife instead. Tears flowed as he spoke about his beloved daughter, but the prosecution painted a starkly different portrait. They reminded jurors of Vickers' constantly changing stories, his initial denials, his shifting explanations. They brought back Dr. Bolton's testimony, her calm scientific analysis standing like a fortress against the emotional chaos surrounding the defense's claims. That 11-centimeter wound was too deep, she had said, the angle too precise. The knife had to have been gripped firmly, thrust with purpose. The jury faced an impossible burden. 12 ordinary people had to cut through the raw emotion of family tragedy and weigh it against cold, hard forensic facts. They had to watch a grieving mother defend the man accused of killing her child, then decide where truth really lay. The decision tormented them. For over 13 hours, they deliberated. A grueling process of examining evidence, testimony, and the competing stories of love and violence laid before them. Finally, they reached their verdict. It wasn't unanimous. By a majority of 10-2, the jury found Simon Vickers guilty of murdering his daughter, Scarlett. The words hit the silent courtroom like a physical blow. Sarah Hall's unwavering faith in her partner hadn't been enough to pull the jury away from where the evidence led them. The accident story had crumbled under scientific certainty's weight. Vickers, who had entered court as a grieving father, now stood as a convicted killer. He was led away in custody, the verdict's finality sealing his fate. Simon Vickers' sentencing took place on February 10th, 2025. Mr. Justice Carter presided, his words forming a final, crushing rejection of the defense Vickers had tried to build. He addressed Vickers directly, his voice carrying the full weight of the judgment about to fall. You have been found guilty of murdering your daughter, Scarlett Vickers, on July 5th, 2024, in your family home, he began. She was just 14 years old. The judge acknowledged the defense's story, the happy family, the playful struggle gone horribly wrong. But he dismissed it all as elaborate fiction. Vickers' final version of events, that he had accidentally swept the knife across the counter into his daughter's chest without realizing what he held, was, in the judge's words, unconvincing and wholly implausible. Mr. Justice Carter carefully laid out the facts before the court. Vickers had been drinking that night and had used cannabis. Neighbors had heard the sounds of an argument echoing through the walls. The wound itself was deep, striking a vital area of the body. The judge's words carried the weight of finality. To harm Scarlett in this way, you must have been close to her. With that, he sentenced Simon Vickers to life in prison, with a minimum of 15 years before any chance of parole. The verdict's aftermath left a wake of unresolved pain and haunting questions for Durham police. Justice may have been served, but the deepest mystery lingered on. Detective Superintendent Craig Rudd captured the lingering confusion that surrounded the case. We may never truly understand what drove Simon Vickers to act as he did that night, he admitted. Scarlett had her entire future stretched out before her. A future tragically stolen by the very man who should have kept her safe. But for Sarah Hall, this case was far from over. Her faith in Simon's innocence burned as strong as ever. To her, the verdict wasn't justice. It was a devastating mistake. She had already lost her daughter, and now she felt the justice system had taken her partner too. She revealed to reporters that Vickers had actually been offered a plea deal for manslaughter, but he'd turned it down. He felt compelled to stand before that court and declare that he would never hurt Scarlett. In the months that followed the trial, Sarah announced her plans to appeal the conviction. She even hired a private investigator, determined to uncover new evidence. Her fight pressed on, a solitary crusade fueled by a mother's grief and a partner's unbreakable loyalty, standing firm against a verdict she simply could not accept. The case of Scarlett Vickers remains a tragedy of staggering proportions. It's the story of a young life snuffed out in a moment of bewildering violence and a family torn apart from within. What it leaves behind is a legacy carved from pure sorrow. A father sits in prison, convicted of taking his child's life. A mother remains trapped in a waking nightmare of loss and disbelief. She's forever haunted by the memory of that Friday night, when laughter filling the kitchen transformed into unthinkable horror. The warm, comforting aroma of spaghetti bolognese would never again be just a simple smell. Now it's a ghost of the life they once shared, and a heartbreaking reminder of everything they lost. Story 2. The Pacific Northwest, with its brooding gray skies and evergreen draped landscapes, was home to Sativa Transu. She was Washington State's own daughter, born and raised in the tight-knit community of Cheney, where neighbors know each other's names and stories run deep. At 26, Sativa embodied everything vibrant about her generation. Fresh out of Eastern Washington University with her exercise science degree in hand, she carried herself with a spirit that friends could only describe as pure sunshine. Her laughter had this way of spreading through a room, and her kindness? It was the kind that touched lives without ever asking for recognition. She was simply one of those rare people who seemed to radiate light, always finding the good in the world and reflecting it back to everyone around her. After graduation, she'd made the move to Milton, near Seattle, drawn by the promise of bigger opportunities, while still keeping those precious family bonds intact. She spoke to her loved ones every single day, without fail. But, despite all that brightness, a dark shadow had crept into Sativa's world. That shadow had a name, Taylor Allen. At 31, he was 5 years older, and they'd been together for 3 long years. To anyone looking from the outside, they seemed like just another couple. But behind closed doors, something far more sinister was unfolding. Friends and family began noticing the warning signs, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Taylor was controlling, possessive, and emotionally destructive. He monitored her phone, slowly cutting her off from the very people who were her foundation. That brilliant ray of sunshine was being systematically eclipsed. The evidence of his explosive temper was literally carved into the walls of her Milton apartment. Her sister, Michaela Bolu, had seen it all. The gaping holes punched through drywall, broken objects scattered like debris after a storm, the silent testimony of his violent outbursts. A former employer who'd hired them both remembered one incident that revealed everything about Taylor's character. When asked to build a simple desk, Taylor had flown into such a rage that he'd destroyed it completely with a mallet. His temper was absolutely ridiculous, the employer, Staka Shirley, would later recall. She was genuinely shocked when she discovered Sativa was dating him. "You couldn't find 2 more completely opposite people if you tried," she'd say. The contrast was just stark. Sativa, this beautiful, gentle soul, and Taylor, this man practically seething with destructive anger. Sativa wasn't blind to the darkness surrounding her. She knew, deep down, that this relationship was poison, that this man was slowly chipping away at everything she was. She'd finally confided in her family that she was going to end it. She just had to survive one last trip with him, a Thanksgiving getaway to Cancun, Mexico. The trip wasn't even her idea. She'd wanted nothing more than to go home for the holiday, to be surrounded by the family that was her bedrock. But Taylor had insisted, and he was incredibly controlling. Michaela would later remember how he'd pushed and pushed for Cancun, and Sativa, perhaps desperately trying to keep the peace, had finally agreed. Her plan was simple: go on this trip, and the moment they returned, she'd leave him for good. It was a plan born from quiet desperation, a finish line she was absolutely determined to cross. The last conversation her father, Jason Trenu, had with her happened at the airport, just before she boarded that flight to what should have been paradise. It was light, casual, the kind of easy chat any father might have with his daughter heading off on vacation. But underneath it all, there was this unspoken tension, this sense of dread that would haunt him forever after. The trip began exactly as so many abusive episodes do, with a fight. Before their plane had even touched Mexican soil, the thin facade of a happy couple on vacation had already started cracking. Sativa texted her sister Michaela from the flight, telling her they'd argued. It seemed like a small detail, but it was incredibly significant. The poison of their relationship had traveled with them, seeping into the recycled air of that airplane cabin, a dark prelude to the horror that was coming. Despite this ominous beginning, Sativa tried her best to salvage something good from the trip. Cancun, with its impossibly blue waters and brilliant sunshine, felt like another world compared to Washington's gray skies. She'd been to Mexico before and had fallen in love with it. She posted pictures on social media, images of a young woman soaking up the sun, enjoying the surf, surrounded by the vibrant colors of tropical paradise. On that first Friday, she even texted her sister about how lovely the weather was. Michaela was just grateful her sister could enjoy herself, even for a moment. She was playing tourist in this land of beauty, but she was also a prisoner, counting down each day until she could finally escape. Her friends became her lifeline, a digital connection back to the safety of home. She stayed in constant contact, texting throughout each day, sharing photos and all the small details of her trip. But then, on the second night, those texts took a terrifying turn. The argument that had ignited on the plane had exploded again, this time with shocking violence. In a desperate flurry of messages to her friends, Sativa revealed that she and Taylor had fought once more. This time, he had actually hurt her. The injury was so severe that she needed stitches. Her father would later learn the devastating details of that night's chaos. Taylor, consumed by drunken fury, had spiraled completely out of control. He was threatening to leap from the balcony of their fourth-floor room at the Al Ritmo Resort. Sativa's father believed this terrifying moment came right after she told Taylor she was leaving him for good. That was the breaking point. Hotel staff found themselves pulled into the chaos as Taylor wandered near the air conditioning units outside their room, babbling incoherently, clearly intoxicated. Hotel security rushed to the scene. They even called the police. But somehow, before the authorities arrived, Taylor was quietly brought back to the room. The police never spoke to either of them. It was a missed opportunity of heartbreaking proportions, a chance to intervene that slipped away in the confusion of that terrible night. Sativa was taken to a doctor in the hotel lobby to have her wound stitched up. The doctor grew concerned. Trapped in the classic cycle of abuse, Sativa tried desperately to protect her abuser. She insisted she had simply fallen, that Taylor hadn't hurt her, that they loved each other. The doctor, sensing the painful truth, reportedly offered her a separate room for the night, a safe place to escape. Sativa refused. Her decision stands as a heartbreaking testament to the complex psychology of domestic violence, the way a victim can feel bound to their abuser, even as danger escalates around them. That night, friends and family back in Washington were in a state of alarm. They had received those troubling texts about the stitches. They knew things had taken a dangerous turn. They tried calling her, texting her, but the constant stream of communication had suddenly stopped. The digital lifeline went silent. All they could do was wait, worry, and pray that she was safe. The next morning, Saturday, November 27th, 2021, their worst fears came true. Michaela would later recount what she had been told. People heard screams in the middle of the night, and they said nothing. In the morning, they found my sister. They found her dead. The discovery was made by a hotel maid who entered the room on the 4th floor and found a scene of unimaginable horror. Sativa Transu, the 26-year-old woman with the contagious laugh and sunny disposition, was gone. Her mother, Jaime Balu, would later describe what authorities told her about her daughter's condition. An autopsy would confirm the brutal cause of death: strangulation. There were defensive wounds, evidence that she had fought for her life against a man who was bigger, stronger, and consumed by murderous rage. At just 140 pounds, she was no match for the 260-pound man who had promised to love her, but had instead become her destroyer. The call came to Sativa's mother, Jaime, at 9:08 a.m. that Saturday morning. It was the U.S. consulate in Mexico. The voice on the other end was formal, official, delivering news that would shatter her world. The words hung in the air, surreal and devastating. Sativa Transu, dead, hotel room. For Michaela, hearing her mother's scream of anguish was a sound of pure heartbreak, a sound she would never forget. The family was plunged into a whirlwind of grief, shock, and a desperate clawing need for answers. Mexican authorities acted quickly. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly to one person. Taylor Allen, the only one with her in that room, was arrested and charged with femicide. The murder of a woman, a crime recognized under Mexican law. A blurred mugshot released by Cancun law enforcement showed him wearing what appeared to be a hotel bathrobe. The mundane garment, a chilling contrast to the monstrous crime he was accused of committing. Public records would later reveal a prior charge of 4th-degree assault against him from 2012. A hint of the violence that had lurked beneath the surface for years. For Sativa's family, the arrest was just the beginning of a long and agonizing journey. Their daughter had been murdered in a foreign country, and they now faced the bewildering bureaucratic nightmare of seeking justice through an unfamiliar legal system, all while grappling with unbearable loss. The first, most urgent task was bringing Sativa home. But the logistics of repatriating a body from another country are complex and expensive. Michaela, heartbroken but determined, started a GoFundMe page to raise money needed to bring her sister back to Washington and pay for a second autopsy. "We want justice, and we want her home," she wrote. A simple, powerful plea that resonated with a community rallying around the grieving family. The response was a testament to the life Sativa had lived. Friends, family, and even strangers touched by the tragedy donated to the cause. It took nearly 2 weeks, but on December 10th, Sativa's body was finally flown back to the United States. The family could at last lay her to rest in the place she had called home. On a cold December day, it was not a somber funeral, but a gathering of love and remembrance for a woman who had brought so much light into their lives. Whitney Ford, her college friend, could barely find words for her disbelief in the crushing weight of loss she felt. "She was perfect," Whitney said, her voice breaking. "She was that friend who meant the world to me. She completely changed how I saw everything and literally opened up the entire world for me." Michaela stood surrounded by an incredible outpouring of support, feeling deeply grateful for the community that had wrapped its arms around her family. "I'm so glad that she lived a full life at least. And she was just so amazing to everyone," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. But even as they celebrated her life, the fight for justice was only just beginning. The family hired a lawyer in Mexico to help them navigate the complex legal system and work alongside the prosecutor. They were promised that the case would be assigned to one of the strictest judges in the country, but the process crawled forward painfully slow. filled with delays and the constant struggle of a language barrier. The family found themselves making frequent, expensive trips from the U.S. to Mexico just to attend court hearings. Each journey served as another painful reminder of why they were there in the first place. The case of Sativa Transu tells the story of intimate terrorism, of a love that slowly twisted into possessive, deadly obsession. It's a story about those red flags that are so often missed or simply dismissed. The escalating patterns of abuse that can build up to the ultimate act of violence. But it's also a story of a family's incredible resilience, their unwavering determination to honor their daughter's memory by fighting for justice and speaking out to save others. Michaela has made it her life's mission to educate women about the warning signs of an abusive relationship. She speaks with the hard-earned authority of someone who has witnessed the worst possible outcome. She urges anyone who feels trapped in the cycle of domestic violence to seek help, to find a way out before it's too late. This is the legacy she's building for her sister. A legacy of hope and survival, born from a tragedy that should never have happened. The case against Taylor Allen continues moving through the Mexican court system. For Sativa's family, no sentence will ever be enough to make up for the life that was stolen from them. But they keep fighting, driven by the memory of a young woman who was truly a ray of sunshine. A light that was snuffed out far too soon, but whose warmth can still be felt in the love of those she left behind. Her story, as heartbreaking as it is, has become a powerful cautionary tale. A desperate plea to a world that too often looks away from the darkness hiding in plain sight. It's a plea to listen for the screams in the middle of the night, and to do something before it's too late. Story 3. The morning of March 14th, 2023, dawned over Wheatsheaf with the gentle promise of a late Australian summer day. The air hung cool and still in this central Victorian hamlet, just a scattering of properties nestled among bushland and paddocks. It carried the sweet scent of eucalyptus and damp earth. For Colin Bainbridge, a robust man of 69, with hands weathered by a lifetime of honest work, it was simply another Tuesday. A day for labor, for purpose, for precious time spent working alongside his son. Joshua was already up, sorting through their tools with practiced efficiency. They had a job waiting, a block of land not far from the main road, bordered by other rural lots. Simple work, really. Clearing scrub and preparing the ground for the landowner's future project. This was the kind of work Colin had done for years. Honest, straightforward. He found quiet satisfaction in transforming unruly patches of land, seeing each job through from start to finish. But more than anything, he treasured these shared hours with Joshua. It was here in the rhythm of sweat and effort that their bond grew strongest. A silent understanding passed between them with each swing of the axe, each pull of the saw. As they loaded their gear, their familiar partnership unfolded. Colin, with decades of experience behind him, directed operations with quiet authority. Joshua, younger and stronger, handled the heavy lifting. They made a good team. Their movements were economical, practiced. They spoke little, but the silence between them felt comfortable, filled with the unspoken affection of a father and son who knew and respected each other deeply. By mid-morning, they'd reached the property. The sun began asserting its warmth as the buzz of their equipment cut through the rural tranquility. Industry in a quiet landscape. They were making excellent progress, watching the untamed scrub slowly give way to their efforts. Colin wiped sweat from his brow and surveyed their work with a satisfied nod. It was shaping up to be a good day. He had no way of knowing that the sounds of his labor, the very evidence of his honest day's work, were traveling across a wire fence into the home of a man who heard them as an attack. He couldn't know that to this complete stranger. He wasn't Colin Bainbridge, devoted father and hard-working man. He was simply the neighbor, an abstract source of grievance rapidly curdling into homicidal rage. Stuart Leslie Lee, 63 years old, sat inside his house like a prisoner of his own corrosive thoughts. For Lee, the world was nothing but hostility, a series of provocations and insults that only he seemed to see. A diagnosed personality disorder left him detached, paranoid, increasingly consumed by conflicts both real and imagined. He was, in the later words of a judge, a sad, angry, embittered person who felt he had had enough. To Stuart Lee, the noise from the adjacent property wasn't just a nuisance. It was a violation, a deliberate, personal assault on his peace, on his small kingdom of solitude. It didn't matter that the work was perfectly lawful, or that the men performing it were complete strangers. In Lee's fractured reality, they were aggressors, and their actions demanded a response. His first move followed society's prescribed path. He picked up the phone and called the police. Then he called again. In total, he would call them 6 times that morning. His voice carried a volatile cocktail of agitation and indignant fury. He demanded they come immediately, stop the noise, intervene on his behalf. He needed police here now. The response he received felt, to his mind, wholly inadequate. A dismissal of his suffering, confirmation of his belief that the entire world stood aligned against him. The exact details of those conversations are lost, but their effect on Lee was crystal clear. He felt ignored, unheard, powerless, and as his frustration mounted, his threats escalated. In one of those calls, his frayed composure finally snapped. He delivered an ultimatum, a chilling promise born of desperation and fury. "If you're not coming," he told the operator, his voice heavy with terrible resolve, "I'm going to go and kill my neighbors." It was a stark, unambiguous declaration of intent, but to the person on the other end of the line, it may have sounded like just another angry caller venting on a busy day. No officers were dispatched with the urgency Lee demanded. The system, in his view, had failed him completely. So Stuart Lee decided to implement his own twisted version of justice. His mind, now locked on its fatal course, moved with terrifying clarity. He walked to his shed, that place where tools of creation and repair were stored. He picked up a red gasoline can, the liquid sloshing ominously within, a prelude to the horror about to unfold. He poured the fuel into a bucket, the acrid smell filling the small space around him. Then he went back into his house and retrieved something simple yet devastating. A lighter. Bucket in one hand, lighter in the other. Stuart Lee walked out of his house and toward the fence line that separated his property from where Colin and Joshua Bainbridge were working, completely unaware of what was coming. The sun blazed high overhead, beating down on 3 men whose lives were about to collide in the most horrific way imaginable. Colin Bainbridge was taking a short break, the morning's hard work taking its toll on his 69-year-old body. Joshua continued working nearby. The air hung thick with the scent of cut grass and gasoline from their machinery. It was such an ordinary scene, a perfect snapshot of rural life. Then everything shattered. Stuart Lee appeared at the fence. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. In his mind, the time for words had passed. The verdict was already in. He climbed over the fence like a man possessed by cold, righteous fury. Colin glanced up, perhaps with mild curiosity, at this stranger approaching. After all, he was on property he was paid to work on. He had no reason to feel afraid. Lee walked straight toward him, no hesitation whatsoever. He lifted the bucket and with one swift, deliberate motion, threw its contents all over Colin Bainbridge. The shock of gasoline drenched him from head to toe. The toxic liquid soaked through his clothes, his skin, his hair. For a heartbeat, there might have been stunned silence, a moment of pure disbelief. What was happening? Why would a stranger do this? Joshua, witnessing this bizarre, aggressive act, started moving toward them. He saw the man, saw his father drenched in liquid, and dread twisted like a knife in his stomach. Before anyone could fully grasp what had just happened, Lee finished what he'd started. He raised his other hand, the one holding the lighter. There was a click, a spark, and then a terrible whoosh as the world erupted in flames. Colin Bainbridge was consumed by fire. The orange inferno swallowed him whole, roaring with terrible hunger. The pain must have been instant and unimaginable, a living nightmare realized in a split second. He became a human torch, staggering across the quiet patch of land he'd been peacefully clearing just moments before. Joshua screamed. He watched his father, his hero, being burned alive. Pure instinct took over. He ran for their work truck, frantically grabbing for the water hose they carried. He scrambled back, hands shaking violently, aiming a pitiful stream of water at the raging flames that had become his father. The fire hissed and spat, beaten back in one spot only to flare up somewhere else. Through the haze of smoke and agony, Colin Bainbridge saw his son desperately fighting to save him. He saw the face of his attacker, this strange, angry man who had just condemned him to such a horrific fate. And in those final, terrible moments of consciousness, he uttered words of pure, heartbreaking disbelief. "I can't believe this has done me in." His words stood as a testament to the sheer senselessness of it all. He wasn't fighting anyone. He was simply the victim of an execution. Having committed this unspeakable act, Stuart Lee turned and fled the property. He scrambled back over the fence and walked calmly to his house. His mission was complete. The disturbance had been silenced. Behind him, he left a scene from hell itself. Joshua's desperate efforts with the hose proved useless against the gasoline-fueled flames. He could only watch in horror as his father collapsed, a blackened, smoldering figure on the ground. The smell of burnt fuel and something far, far worse filled the air. The quiet of Wheat Chief had been shattered forever. Emergency services, summoned by Joshua's frantic, hysterical call, descended on the property. Paramedics worked desperately to stabilize Colin, to somehow manage the catastrophic injuries covering most of his body. An air ambulance was called, the rhythmic thump of its rotors signaling just how grave the situation had become. Colin Bainbridge was rushed to the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, home to one of Australia's finest burn units. But his injuries were simply too severe. The flames had ravaged him completely. Reports would later cite burns covering between 70 and 81% of his body. That night, surrounded by the sterile, beeping machinery of intensive care, Colin Bainbridge died. The simple, honest man from Wheat Chief was gone. While doctors had fought to save Colin's life, police officers went to Stuart Lee's home. They found him standing in front of his house. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't agitated. He was holding a cup of coffee. His confession came as calm and detached as his demeanor. "I've had trouble with my neighbors," he told the arresting officers. "I threw petrol over the people, and I lit him in flames, fire." He claimed he was just defending himself, a statement so divorced from reality that it offered a terrifying glimpse into his twisted mind. He was taken into custody, this 63-year-old man, who had just committed one of the most brutal murders Victoria had seen in years. It was his very first time behind bars. The wheels of justice began to turn. At first, Stuart Lee faced charges of attempted murder. Colin was still clinging to life when the handcuffs clicked shut. But as that terrible night wore on and Colin slipped away, everything changed. The charges grew heavier. Stuart Leslie Lee now stood accused of murder, intentionally causing serious injury, and arson causing death. The case made its way to the Supreme Court of Victoria. The evidence was damning. An eyewitness, the victim's own son, no less. Lee's own phone calls to police, complete with his chilling threat to kill. His eerily calm confession right there at the scene. But perhaps the most revealing piece came from forensic psychiatrist Dr. Andrew Carroll. His assessment painted a disturbing portrait. Here was a man consumed by a personality disorder, riddled with paranoia, and cut off from human connection. Dr. Carroll described Lee's growing obsession with neighborhood disputes, grievances that had festered and grown toxic in the isolation of his rural home, until they finally erupted into unthinkable violence. Wednesday, April 23, 2025. Stuart Lee stood before the Supreme Court of Victoria. Through his lawyer, he entered his plea to the charge of murdering Colin Bainbridge. Guilty. 2 months later, on June 26, 2025, the day of reckoning arrived. Justice Andrew Tiney took his place on the bench. The judge faced an impossible task, making sense of the senseless, finding just punishment for an act of incomprehensible brutality. He looked down at the sad, angry man in the dock and somehow had to explain to the court, to Colin Bainbridge's grieving family, how this nightmare had come to pass. Justice Tiney's words cut deep, a devastating indictment of Lee's actions, yet also a sobering reflection on his fractured mind. Yes, the judge acknowledged, Lee had reached out to police. But these weren't cries for help. They were demands for validation. You contacted the police in the belief and hoped that you could shut Mr. Bainbridge down, the judge declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. And when met with no satisfactory response from the police as you saw it, your indignant anger overcame your clear understanding of the wrongfulness of your intended actions, and you committed murder. The message was crystal clear. Lee knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't madness. This was malice, twisted by a warped view of the world. When you acted as you did, you were far from being a normal person with normally regulated emotions and the normal feelings of empathy towards your fellow man. Justice Tiney continued, his gaze fixed on Lee. You were a sad, angry, and embittered person who felt he had had enough and was going to strike a blow, no matter the consequences. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The sentence for the murder of Colin Bainbridge, a man Lee didn't even know. Stuart Leslie Lee would spend 35 years behind bars. No chance of parole for 27 years. By then, he'd be ancient. The 835 days he'd already served would count toward his sentence. Justice had been served, at least in the way courts can deliver it. A dangerous man was locked away from society. But for the Bainbridge family, no sentence could ever fill the gaping hole left by Colin's horrific death. A son had watched his father burn. A family had lost their rock. A community had lost a neighbor. All because of the sound of honest work and one man's paranoid fury. The quiet eventually returned to Wheat Chief, but it was different now, forever haunted by memories of fire and a father's last, disbelieving words. Story 4. The cold, crisp air of a Canadian winter can be invigorating. A clean slate that promises fresh starts and new beginnings. For Alison Maher, a sun-kissed girl from Gosford, New South Wales, the snow-dusted slopes of the Delta Ski Resort in Kamloops, British Columbia, became the backdrop to what felt like a fairy tale. It was 2006, and she was on a working holiday, thousands of miles from the familiar warmth of the Australian coast. Here, among the towering pines and pristine powder, she met Curtis McConnell. He was a local, grounded and steady. To Alison, he represented a future she hadn't even known she was searching for. Their connection sparked immediately, like warmth cutting through the frosty mountain air. Romance blossomed quickly between them. They married in Australia in January 2007, a celebration where two worlds beautifully collided. That same July, still in her homeland, Alison gave birth to their first son, Connor. He was a beautiful baby, a perfect blend of both his parents. The new family soon returned to Canada, settling in Millet, a small town in Alberta south of Edmonton. They bought a house, a home they planned to fill with laughter and memories. It painted a picture of domestic bliss, a life carefully constructed and brimming with promise. In March 2009, their second son, Jaden, was born. Allison, who had started working at an oil company in nearby Leduc, would later confess in court that she hadn't planned for a second child. It was a small crack, but a telling one in their perfect facade. To neighbors and friends, the McConnells seemed like the ideal family. Allison was seen as a devoted mother, caring and attentive. The walls of their home displayed photographs capturing happier times, birthdays, holidays, and those simple everyday moments of a young family in love. Curtis worked at a hardware store, providing steadily for his family, while Allison balanced her new job with the demands of motherhood. From the outside, their life embodied the Canadian dream, built on the foundation of a chance meeting on a snowy mountain. But by the fall of 29, that dream was beginning to unravel. The laughter that once filled their home gave way to tense silences and unspoken grievances. Sharp words replaced gentle conversations. The reasons were complex, a slow erosion of love that had once seemed so effortless. Curtis moved into the basement, creating a physical barrier that reflected the emotional chasm opening between them. Allison, who had always battled periods of darkness and depression, found herself spiraling downward. The unraveling of her marriage felt like the complete collapse of her world. In December 2009, Curtis filed for divorce and moved out, seeking refuge at his parents' house. This became the final, decisive blow. What followed wasn't an amicable separation, but a bitter and destructive custody battle. Allison, feeling isolated and abandoned in a foreign country, made a desperate plea. She wanted to return home to Australia and take her sons with her. Curtis, equally determined, fought to keep his children in Canada. Battle lines were drawn, and their two little boys, Connor and Jaden, were caught in the crossfire. A judge, weighing both arguments, delivered a verdict that would become a tragic catalyst. The children were to remain in Canada. For Allison, this decision wasn't just a legal ruling. It felt like a life sentence, trapping her in a world that had turned cold and hostile. The last weekend of January 2010 was shrouded in a fog of despair. The legal battle had taken its toll, and Allison's already fragile mental state had completely fractured. She was consumed by profound depression, turning to alcohol and sleeping pills to numb the overwhelming pain. The house in Millet, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. In quiet moments when the boys were asleep, the silence became deafening, filled only with echoes of what she had lost and what she feared she'd never regain. Her computer became a window into her darkest thoughts. Her online searches created a chilling chronicle of a mind contemplating its own end. She researched ways to escape pain that had become unbearable. In the basement, investigators would later find evidence of her desperation. The precise timeline of what happened in that house remained shrouded in the fog of Allison's memory, a memory she would later claim was completely wiped clean. What is known is this. At some point during that weekend, the 31-year-old mother took her two sons, 2.5-year-old Connor and 10-month-old Jaden, to the bathroom. In that very space where they had likely splashed and played, she ended their lives. After this unthinkable act, she left the house. She drove to Edmonton, a city whose lights must have seemed a world away from the darkness she'd left behind. She had a meal, a strange, surreal act of normalcy in the midst of a nightmare. Then she drove to an overpass, climbed the barrier, and jumped. She landed on the road below, her body broken by the fall. But somehow, her life was spared. On February 1st, 2010, the phone rang in the McConnell family home. The call came from Edmonton police, cutting through Curtis's day like a blade. His wife had been in a serious accident, the officer explained. A woman found severely injured after a fall from an overpass. The officer knew nothing about any children. Dread twisted like a knot in Curtis's stomach. He raced to the house in Millet, desperate to check on his sons. The silence hit him immediately, too deep, too complete. He called their names, his voice bouncing off empty walls. Then he found it. The bathroom door, locked tight. Panic surged through him as he grabbed a knife and forced the door open. What he saw would burn itself into his memory forever, a nightmare that would never release its grip. His two beautiful boys floated motionless in the bathtub. There on the toilet seat, catching the harsh bathroom light, lay Allison's wedding ring. Curtis would come to see this as her final, vengeful message. A symbol of love, twisted into something unrecognizable. To come home to find my kids left to rot by the person I love and trusted more than anyone else has made it so hard to trust anyone again, he would later write in a statement read before the court. Allison McConnell survived her suicide attempt. She woke up in a hospital bed, bones shattered, claiming her memory of the preceding days had been completely erased. From the hospital, she was transferred to Alberta Hospital Edmonton, a psychiatric facility where she would remain for the next 15 months. While she received psychiatric care, a funeral was held for Connor and Jaden. Their small caskets broke hearts, a devastating reminder of two lives cut tragically short. Family from both sides gathered to mourn, but their mother's name was nowhere to be found in the service. The case went to trial with Crown Prosecutor Gordon Hatch, pushing for a second-degree murder conviction. The defense, led by lawyer Peter Royal, painted a different picture. A woman driven to the breaking point by crushing depression and a bitter divorce. The trial exposed the darkest corners of Allison's life. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Alberto Choi, testified that her memory loss might be real, a psychological shield protecting her from the horrific reality of what she'd done. But he also revealed something chilling. During therapy, she'd experienced a brief flash of memory, an image of herself holding a child down in the water, a crack in her amnesia's armor. Dr. Choi described her as a severe suicide risk, a woman tormented by her boys' deaths, yet confused about her own role in their tragedy. The court also learned about a devastating trauma from Allison's past. As a teenager, she had been impregnated by her own father. Justice Michelle Keaton acknowledged in her final decision that this undoubtedly shaped the person Allison became. The possibility that Curtis had threatened to expose this secret, along with intimate details of their marriage, may have contributed to Allison's mental collapse. In April 2012, Justice Keaton delivered her verdict. She found Allison McConnell not guilty of murder, but guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The judge ruled there was reasonable doubt about whether Allison had specific intent to kill her children, given her severe depression, her medicated state, and her claimed memory loss. I am not satisfied that the Crown has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Ms. McConnell had the specific intent to cause the death of her children, Justice Keaton stated in her 19-page decision, calling the drownings an unspeakable tragedy. The sentence that followed ignited a firestorm of controversy. Allison received 6 years in prison, but with credit for time already served in the psychiatric hospital, her sentence dropped to just 15 months. Since she had already served that time, she was eligible for immediate release and scheduled for deportation to Australia. The verdict and sentence triggered outrage. The boy's grandmother, Audrey McConnell, sobbed in court while reading her victim impact statement, describing how she placed birthday candles on her grandsons' graves and sang happy birthday to them. Curtis McConnell filed a civil suit against Allison for $940,000. Alberta's Minister of Justice, Jonathan Dennis, publicly condemned the sentence as simply too lenient and vowed to fight her deportation. "This is not over," he declared, promising to pursue an appeal to bring her back to Canada for a harsher penalty. Despite the government's efforts, they couldn't block her deportation. On April 10, 2013, Allison McConnell boarded a plane bound for Australia, dotting out. She arrived at Kingsford Smith International Airport a free woman, while Canadian prosecutors prepared an appeal to overturn her conviction and retry her on the original murder charges. The appeal hearing was scheduled for October 30, 2013. Back in her hometown of Gosford, Allison remained under a doctor's care, but not constant supervision. She had become a ghost of her former self, haunted by the events that had unfolded in Canada. Her lawyer, Peter Royal, said the looming appeal weighed heavily on her mind. Her mom told McConnell she was deeply concerned, he explained, adding that Allison seemed haunted by everything that had unfolded. Just a few weeks before her death, Allison had attended the christening of a friend's newborn baby. What should have been a joyous celebration became a painful reminder of her own lost children. Her mother, Helen Meager, confided to Royal that the event had left Allison deeply emotional and despondent. I guess it brought back memories of her own children's christenings, her lawyer quietly speculated. In September 2013, just weeks before she might have been ordered back to Canada to face a new trial, Allison vanished. Her mother reported her missing within hours. Her body was discovered shortly after beneath the Brian McGowan Bridge in West Gosford. The identification papers found with her confirmed what everyone feared. Allison McConnell had taken her own life. Her death marked a final tragic chapter in a story where no one could claim victory. Peter Royal, who had stood by her side in court, called the news devastating. There aren't many cases that stay with you, he said quietly, but this is one of them. Oh, but Alberta's deputy premier, Thomas Lukaszak, tweeted that it was a heartbreaking end to what was already a profound tragedy. The town of Millet, where the family had once called home, released a statement hoping that this final chapter might eventually bring some measure of peace to everyone affected. But for the family of Connor and Jaden, peace seemed impossibly far away. Allison McConnell's death wasn't an end to their suffering. It was simply a grim conclusion to a legal battle they felt had robbed them of justice. The case of Allison McConnell remains a deeply troubling story about mental illness, a marriage that fell apart, and a mother's unthinkable actions. It's a story that began with a fairy tale romance on a snowy mountain and ended in a cascade of tragedies that shattered lives across 2 continents. A heartbreaking reminder of how swiftly dreams can transform into nightmares. Story 5. The water off Harbor Island shimmers in a shade of blue so pure it seems to exist only in dreams. Gentle waves lap against the pale pink sands of its famous beaches, a tranquil rhythm that has long been the soundtrack to the lives of the ultra-wealthy who treat this bohemian sliver of paradise as their private backyard. Here, time itself seems to slow. It's measured not in hours and minutes, but in the silent glide of multi-million-dollar super yachts across the horizon. These vessels, gleaming white temples of opulence, drift into the marinas like visiting gods, their very presence a testament to a world far removed from ordinary life. In the early summer of 2025, one such vessel was the M.Y. Far From It, a 43-meter Richmond yacht that moved with stately grace. To the casual observer, she was a floating palace, a marvel of engineering and design that could be chartered for nearly $140,000 a week. Her decks were immaculate. Her interiors, a hushed sanctuary of bespoke luxury. For the select few who could afford her, she was an escape. A promise of sun-drenched days and carefree nights under a canopy of stars. But a yacht has 2 worlds. There's the world above deck, a carefully curated illusion of effortless perfection for the guests. And then there's the world below, the hidden engine that keeps the illusion running. It's a world of long hours, cramped quarters, and relentless work. This world is populated by a nomadic tribe of crew members who chase the sun from one exotic port to another. They are the invisible hands that polish the silver, mix the cocktails, and navigate the seas. It's a life of breathtaking vistas and grinding repetition, a gilded cage where the price of paradise is paid in sweat and sacrifice. In this world lived Paige Bell. At 20 years old, she was a newcomer to the industry, but she possessed a spirit that seemed tailor-made for it. Friends and family described her as a golden girl, a true firecracker whose energy and laughter were infectious. With her bold and fiery personality, she radiated a light and warmth that left an indelible mark on everyone she met. Originally from South Africa, Paige had embraced the yachting life with the same boundless enthusiasm she applied to everything. She'd started her career on another vessel, the MY Sweet Emotion, where her colleagues quickly became a second family. They remembered her not just as a teammate, but as a sister, someone whose boundless compassion made the long days at sea feel shorter, and the quiet moments under the stars feel like home. In the weeks leading up to July 2025, Paige was practically vibrating with excitement. Her 21st birthday was on July 14th, and she'd been planning her celebration for weeks, insisting to anyone who would listen that the day would go off with a bang. It was a milestone she was eagerly anticipating, a coming of age to be celebrated in this extraordinary new life she was building. Her mother back in South Africa was already planning to mark the occasion. Paige's favorite cake was red velvet, and the plan was simple. Everyone who loved her, no matter where they were in the world, would eat a slice in her honor. It was a small, sweet gesture to connect them all to the girl who was so far from home, yet so close to their hearts. After her time on the Sweet Emotion, Paige had joined the crew of the Far From It. It was another step up in her burgeoning career, another stamp in her passport. But the two worlds of a super yacht are separated by more than just a staircase. The engine room, the heart of the vessel, is a place of heat, noise, and steel, a world away from the sun-bleached teak decks above. It was the domain of the engineer, a place of mechanical precision and solitary focus. On the Far From It, that domain belonged to a 39-year-old Mexican national named Bridget Munoz. Life below deck is intimate by necessity. Crew members share small cabins and tight common spaces, a proximity that can foster deep bonds or quiet resentments. There's little room for personal space and even less for secrets. In this confined world, a wrong word, an unwelcome glance, it all matters. It soon became clear to Paige that Munoz's attention towards her was crossing a line. He wouldn't leave her alone, his presence becoming a source of growing unease. In an industry where professionalism is paramount, his behavior was a breach of the unwritten code. But more than that, it was a violation of her sense of safety. Paige was not one to suffer in silence. She was bold. She was fiery. And she'd been raised to stand up for herself. She did what she was supposed to do. She reported the inappropriate behavior to her captain. An official warning was issued to Munoz. He was told to stop, to keep his distance. But he was not fired. The machinery of the yacht, both literal and figurative, kept turning. The charters continued. The guests remained oblivious. And below deck, the shadow of that warning lingered in the narrow corridors. The dynamic had shifted. A complaint had been made. A line had been drawn. But the source of the problem remained just a few feet away in the throbbing heart of the ship. The 3rd of July, 2025, dawned with that familiar Bahamian warmth washing over everything. The Far From It sat docked at Harbor Island, a true jewel in its own right, known for drawing celebrities and superyachts like moths to a flame. For the crew, it was simply another day of work. Paige was last seen around 10:00 a.m. sharing a tender moment as she kissed her boyfriend goodbye on the deck. The day rolled forward with its usual rhythm of duties and routines. Guests were attended to with care. Meals were lovingly prepared, and the yacht gleamed like a diamond under the afternoon sun. But as the hours drifted by, an unsettling quiet settled over the crew. Paige was missing. In the close-knit world of a yacht, when someone vanishes, it's felt immediately. A search began, quiet at first, then growing more desperate by the minute. They combed through her cabin, scoured the decks, searched the galley. Eventually, the hunt led them down to the world below, into the noise and sweltering heat of the engine room. It was there, shortly after 10 p.m., that the dream of life in paradise was shattered beyond repair. The police were summoned to the marina, and what they discovered aboard the Far From It would send shockwaves rippling not just across the island, but through the entire global yachting community. Paige Bell was found unresponsive, lying still in the engine room. A local doctor pronounced her dead at the scene. The official report would later note she had sustained visible injuries. Such sterile words for such a brutal reality. She had been discovered partially undressed, with wounds to her neck and defensive injuries covering her arms. Clear evidence that she had fought bravely until the very end. Lying nearby was Bridget Munoz, the ship's engineer. He was covered in blood, bearing severe self-inflicted wounds to his arms in what authorities believed was a failed attempt to take his own life. In that moment, the bubble of tranquility surrounding Harbor Island burst completely. Those famous pink sands and turquoise waters had become the backdrop to an unthinkable crime scene. As police launched their investigation, news of the tragedy spread like wildfire through the tight-knit yachting world. The initial confusion only deepened with waves of misinformation. Some early reports even showed photos of the wrong person entirely. But gradually, the facts began to emerge, painting a picture too grim to fully comprehend. Munoz was taken into custody and rushed to a nearby clinic for emergency treatment. For Paige's family back in South Africa, the news hit like a devastating blow. Her sister Chelsea would later write about the family's unimaginable journey, their hearts completely broken by the brutal way Paige's life had been stolen. Her parents, drowning in grief, began the agonizing process of traveling to the Bahamas, not just to bring them and their precious daughter home, but to seek justice against the person who had taken her life. The yachting community's response was both immediate and overwhelming. The crew of the Sweet Emotion, Paige's former vessel, quickly launched a GoFundMe campaign to help her family shoulder the crushing financial burden of travel and legal costs. Their modest goal of $16,000 was surpassed in less than a week, ultimately raising over $52,000. A powerful testament to the love and respect Paige had earned in her brief but meaningful career. Paige was more than a teammate, they wrote. She was family. Their words offered small comfort in the face of such profound loss. On July 9, 2025, Bridget Munoz appeared in magistrate court in Nassau, the Bahamian capital. He was officially charged with the murder of Paige Bell. During that first court appearance, he wasn't required to enter a plea. Chief Magistrate Roberto Reckley denied him bail and ordered him held in custody, with his next hearing scheduled for November 20th, 2025. He would remain behind bars as the wheels of justice began their slow turn. July 14th came and went. The day that should have been a joyous celebration of Paige's 21st birthday instead became a day of remembrance. In marinas stretching from Fort Lauderdale to ports across the world, moments of silence were held in her honor. Following her mother's heartfelt request, people everywhere ate red velvet cake in her memory, sharing photos and cherished memories of the beautiful soul she had been. The Bell family and the crew from the Far From It released a joint statement expressing their eternal gratitude for the incredible outpouring of love. Your tribute, unity, and love honored Paige in a way that she would have absolutely adored, they wrote. There's no doubt she would have been ecstatic to know that her yachting family around the world celebrated with her. What should have been a joyful birthday celebration had become a somber, unified chorus of grief and solidarity. Paige's murder did far more than break hearts. It exposed a dangerous vulnerability at the very core of the yachting industry. The fact that she had reported her killer for harassment, only for him to receive nothing more than a warning, became a lightning rod for fierce criticism. The standing orders for any ship should be zero tolerance for harassment. One industry veteran stated without hesitation. This tragedy brought to light a long-overlooked issue: the complete lack of mandatory background checks for crew members. Under the Maritime Labor Convention, the MLC, there's a glaring gap. No requirement exists for criminal background checks, an oversight that many yacht owners simply assume someone else is handling. When Pa lost her life, that assumption shattered. A petition on change, or demanding mandatory background checks for all crew members, quickly gathered thousands of signatures. The case transformed into something much bigger, a rallying cry for real change in an industry that had operated for far too long under informal oversight. Amir, a seasoned yacht broker, stepped forward with the voluntary Page Belt Pledge. This initiative would require criminal, credit, and drug screenings for crew members, creating a new standard of safety and accountability. But questions still echoed through marinas and management offices worldwide. When a crew member felt unsafe, where could they turn? Who would offer them real protection? Eventually, the vessel was moved from the Bahamas, finding its way to Safe Harbor Marina in Fort Lauderdale, a bustling hub of the super yacht industry. The boat itself became a haunting landmark, a physical reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded in its engine room. The legal battle against Bridge Munoz continues, and Paige Bell's family refuses to give up their fight for justice. But her legacy is already taking shape. It lives in the grief of her family and friends, in those shared slices of red velvet cake, and in the soul-searching of an entire industry forced to face its own shortcomings. She was a young woman with dreams of becoming a doctor, a golden girl with a spirit that lit up every room. She traveled the world seeking adventure, and found it in the crystal-clear waters of the Bahamas. But she also encountered a danger that had been allowed to lurk in the shadows below deck. Her life was tragically cut short, yet her death has become something powerful, a catalyst demanding change, ensuring her name will be remembered not just as a headline, but as a turning point. The story of Paige Bell serves as a heartbreaking reminder that even in paradise, the darkest corners of human nature can find places to hide. The fight for safety, respect, and justice remains a voyage that never truly ends. Story 6 and 9. The winter of 2002 crept into Oregon City like an unwelcome visitor, bringing with it a persistent damp chill that clung to the fir trees and turned the gray skies the color of lead. In the sprawling, low-slung apartment complex on Newell Creek Drive, nestled against the curve of South Beaver Creek Road, life moved to a familiar rhythm. This was a place of working families and latchkey kids, a community bound together by proximity and the shared struggle of making ends meet. It felt ordinary, safe even, predictable in all the ways that mattered. But in the pre-dawn darkness of January 9th, something shifted. A thread was pulled from the fabric of that ordinary world, and a silence began to spread. A silence that would soon grow into a collective scream of terror and disbelief. It started with a 12-year-old girl named Ashley Pont, a girl with a troubled smile and secrets far too heavy for her young shoulders. She walked out of her apartment that morning and into a void, as if the cold Oregon air had simply swallowed her whole. Her best friend felt that void most acutely. 13-year-old Miranda Gaddis was a girl on the cusp of everything. Her face framed by a cascade of dark hair, her eyes holding the bright, fierce energy of youth. She and Ashley were inseparable. Their friendship was a lifeboat in the choppy waters of adolescence. They were part of the same school dance team, their lives woven together through sleepovers, shared secrets, and the daily ritual of walking to the school bus stop at the end of their street. When Ashley vanished, Miranda became the public face of the search. Her worry was etched into her young features for the television cameras. She stood at that bus stop where her friend was last seen, a small, solitary figure against the vast, terrifying emptiness of Ashley's absence. She spoke of hope, of fear, of confusion. 2 months later, in a cruel and perfect echo of the first tragedy, that same emptiness would come for her. On March 8th, Miranda Gaddis would walk that same well-worn path toward the same bus stop. And like her best friend, she would simply disappear into the cold Oregon morning, leaving behind a community paralyzed by a horrifying realization. A monster was living among them. Ashley Pond was a child forced to grow up too fast. Her life was a chaotic landscape of instability and betrayal. Her father, a man who should have been her protector, was in jail for having hurt her in ways that left deep, invisible scars. Her home life with her mother, Lori, was tumultuous, a cycle of conflict and neglect that sometimes saw her locked out of her own apartment. She was a girl adrift, seeking refuge wherever she could find it. For a time, she had even lived with neighbors, the Weavers. Her life stood as a testament to a system and a family that had profoundly failed her. Yet through it all, she retained a spark, a resilience that her teachers saw and admired. She was a girl who had been dealt a rough hand, but was still determined to play the game. On the morning of January 9th, 2002, she went through the familiar motions of getting ready for school. She left her family's apartment around 7:15 a.m. to walk the short distance to the bus stop. A daily journey she had made countless times before. But on this day, she never arrived. The school bus came and went, its seats filled with the noisy chatter of her classmates. Ashley's seat remained empty. When she didn't return home that afternoon, a quiet unease began to curdle into panic. The initial police response was colored by the chaos of her life. The theory was simple. She was a runaway, a troubled kid who had finally decided to flee a home that offered little peace. It was a plausible explanation, and it fatally slowed the momentum of the early investigation. But as days turned into weeks, the runaway theory began to fray. Ashley had taken nothing with her. Her friends, her family. No one had heard from her. The search intensified, and the media descended on the small Oregon City community. At the center of the storm was a man who lived in the house that anchored the street, a house the girls had to pass every morning on their way to the bus. His name was Ward Weaver III. Weaver presented a facade of affable working-class normalcy. He was a 39-year-old toolmaker, a father himself. His daughter Mallory was the same age as Ashley and Miranda, part of their tight-knit circle of friends. The Weaver house was a frequent gathering spot, a place for sleepovers and teenage hangouts. Weaver knew the girls well. He sometimes gave them rides to school if they were running late. He was a familiar, seemingly harmless presence in their lives. But beneath the surface, darkness lurked. In the months before she disappeared, Ashley had made a terrifying accusation. She had told her mother and her best friend Miranda that Ward Weaver had tried to assault her in his house. It was a cry for help that went unanswered. The police were informed, but for reasons that would later become the subject of intense scrutiny and outrage, no charges were ever filed. No meaningful action was taken. The system that had already betrayed Ashley so completely would fail her one final devastating time. When police first approached Weaver about Ashley's disappearance, he appeared remarkably composed. Cooperative, even. His explanations flowed smoothly, each denial sounding reasonable on the surface. He provided alibis that shifted slightly with each telling, yet remained frustratingly difficult to disprove. He was the prime suspect, a fact he seemed to savor. In a bizarre display of twisted pride, he actually called reporters together to announce this himself. The FBI combed through his home and property. They found nothing. The investigation ground to a halt, trapped in an agonizing limbo. Ashley Pond had simply vanished. Her bright smile gazed out from missing posters, a silent, haunting accusation. Her fate became a heavy question that lingered in the damp Oregon air. For 2 long months, the community existed in a state of suspended terror. The search for Ashley pressed on, but hope faded with each passing day. Grim resignation crept in to fill the void. Then Friday, March 8th arrived, and the nightmare began again with chilling, mirror-like precision. Miranda Gaddis, The very girl who had spoken so passionately about her missing friend, who had warned others about Ward Weaver, disappeared. Just like Ashley, she left her apartment that morning walking toward the bus stop. Just like Ashley, she never made it there. The news struck the community like a physical blow. Any lingering belief that Ashley had simply run away crumbled instantly. The terrifying truth became crystal clear. A predator was hunting the children of their neighborhood. Someone bold and methodical, operating right under their noses. The two disappearances formed a perfect, horrifying reflection of each other. Two friends, 2 months apart. Same apartment complex. Same room. Same time of day. The investigation's focus, which had never truly shifted away, now locked onto Ward Weaver with crushing intensity. He had become the dark center around which this entire tragedy revolved. Media attention exploded. The case captured national headlines. The faces of both missing girls appeared on People magazine's cover. Reporters set up camp on South Beaver Creek Road. Their cameras remained fixed on that unremarkable house where Weaver lived. The house that had become ground zero for a community's fear and suspicion. Weaver seemed to feed off the attention. He granted interviews, his manner a disturbing blend of grieving victim and confident performer. In one notorious interview with local television reporter Anna Song, he stood in his backyard on a freshly poured concrete slab. He gestured broadly, proclaiming his innocence, while Ashley Pond's body lay buried just feet beneath where he stood. "I'm putting in a jacuzzi," he told a newspaper reporter when questioned about the slab. "Last time I checked, that wasn't against the law." His boldness was staggering. A performance of such brazen deception, it was almost incomprehensible. He complained to a national morning show that police were unfairly targeting him. He warned his daughter's friends not to spend the night because he was a suspect. Their daughters might be next, he said. Looking back, that statement sounds less like a complaint and more like a chilling threat. Police were certain they had their man, but they were trapped. No physical evidence, no bodies, no confession. They watched him, they questioned him, but they couldn't make an arrest. For 5 agonizing months, March through August, the case remained locked in this torturous stalemate. Weaver continued his daily routine, a monster hiding in plain sight. Meanwhile, 2 families and an entire community remained prisoners to one terrible, unanswered question. What had happened to their daughters? To truly understand the monster that was Ward Weaver III, you have to look back into his family's dark and twisted history. Evil, it seemed, ran in his blood. His father, Ward Weaver Jr., was cut from the same poisonous cloth. Back in the 1980s, the elder Weaver had been convicted of a savage double murder in California. He had killed a young man whose car had broken down, then kidnapped and attacked the man's girlfriend before taking her life too. In a chilling echo of the crimes his son would later commit, he had buried his female victim in his own backyard. At the time Ashley and Miranda vanished, Ward Weaver Jr. sat on death row at San Quentin. His crime served as a grim preview of the horror about to unfold in Oregon City. This generational legacy of violence wasn't lost on investigators. It revealed a family where extreme brutality wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern. And tragically, that pattern didn't end with Ward Weaver III. It would extend in one final devastating twist to his own son, Francis. Francis Weaver was 19 when the girls disappeared. He had grown up in the shadow of his father's explosive temper and dark secrets. He was both a product of and witness to the dysfunction that defined the Weaver household. He was also, as it would turn out, the key to cracking the entire case. For months, he had watched his father play this deadly cat-and-mouse game with police and media. He had listened to the denials, witnessed the strange, confident behavior, and harbored a terrible suspicion, a suspicion that would finally be confirmed in a moment of violent confrontation that had nothing and yet everything to do with the 2 missing girls. The break in the case came not from brilliant detective work or a forensic breakthrough, but from the implosion of Ward Weaver's own violent world. On the night of August 13th, 2002, 5 months after Miranda's disappearance, Weaver's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. His son Francis had brought his 19-year-old girlfriend over to the house. At some point, the two men left. When the girlfriend found herself alone with Weaver, his demeanor completely changed. The friendly family man vanished, replaced by something darker. He attacked her, and she suffered a brutal assault behind closed doors. She managed to escape, running from the house and covering herself with a tarp from the yard. She flagged down a passing car and was taken to a nearby store, where she called Francis for help. Francis rushed to her side, then made the most important phone call of his life. He called 911. In a voice filled with rage and desperation, he told the dispatcher what his father had done to his girlfriend, and then he lowered the boom. He told them that his father had recently confessed to him that he was the one who had killed Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis. He told them to search the backyard, to look at the new concrete slab. It was the moment the police had been waiting for. Francis's statement, combined with the assault on his girlfriend, gave them the probable cause they needed to finally obtain a comprehensive search warrant and take Weaver into custody. The game was over. Weaver was arrested for the assault, but everyone knew it was just the beginning. The search for the girls was about to reach its grim and terrible conclusion. As a final defiant gesture, Ashley Pond's stepmother erected a sign next to the concrete slab on Weaver's property. It read simply, "Dig me up." On Saturday, August 24th, 2002, the quiet suburban street of South Beaver Creek Road was transformed into a massive, sprawling crime scene. The FBI, along with state and local police, descended on the Weaver property. Their vehicles and equipment stood as a stark symbol that the waiting was finally over. The search was methodical and grim. They started with the house and the outbuildings. In a storage shed behind the main house, they found it. A cardboard box, the kind a microwave oven comes in. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were the decomposed remains of a young girl. The next day, Sunday, August 25th, they turned their attention to the concrete slab in the backyard, the one Weaver had so arrogantly stood upon for the television cameras. With jackhammers and heavy equipment, they broke through the concrete. Beneath it, buried deep in the earth, they found a 55-gallon metal barrel. They carefully unearthed it, a sense of dread hanging heavy in the air. Inside the barrel, they found the body of the second girl. Dental records would soon confirm what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains in the shed belonged to Miranda Gaddis. The body in the barrel under the concrete was Ashley Pond. After 8 months of agonizing uncertainty, the two friends had been found. They had been there all along, just yards from the bus stop where they were last seen. Their bodies hidden on the property of the man who was supposed to be a trusted neighbor, a family friend. The search was over. The long, slow march toward justice had just begun. With the discovery of the bodies, the legal case against Ward Weaver III solidified. He was indicted on multiple counts of aggravated murder and other serious charges. The community, which had been united in the search for the girls, was now united in its grief and its desire for justice. A public memorial service was held at the local high school. An overflow crowd packed the auditorium to remember the two young lives that had been so brutally stolen. Weaver's legal proceedings were marked by the same erratic and manipulative behavior he had displayed during the investigation. He pleaded not guilty, and his lawyers raised questions about his mental fitness to stand trial. But state psychiatrists ultimately found him competent, and the case moved forward. Faced with overwhelming evidence against him and the prospect of the death penalty, Weaver finally abandoned his charade. On September 22, 24, he accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to the murders of both Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis. By doing so, he avoided a trial and a potential death sentence. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison with no possibility of parole. The case left an indelible scar on Oregon City. It was a story of almost unimaginable evil, but it was also a story of systemic failure. The fact that Ashley Pond's initial accusation of sexual abuse against Weaver was never acted upon remains a source of profound and painful regret. Had her desperate cries for help been heard, had the system responded the way it should have, both she and her best friend Miranda would almost certainly still be with us today. But the dark legacy of the Weaver family didn't end with Ward Weaver III's imprisonment. In a final heartbreaking twist, his son, Francis Weaver, the young man whose 911 call had been the key to cracking the case wide open, found himself on the wrong side of the law. In 2014, he was arrested and later convicted of murder for his role in a drug deal gone terribly wrong. He too received a life sentence. The cycle of violence that had begun with his grandfather on California's death row had now consumed a third generation, a bloodline that seemed cursed by an unbreakable capacity for violence. Today, the names of Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis live on as a cautionary tale. A chilling story of a predator who hid in plain sight and of two young girls whose friendship bound them together in life, and in a death that came far too soon. Their story stands as a testament to the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most ordinary suburban surfaces. And it serves as a tragic reminder of the devastating cost when a cry for help goes unheard. Story 7. The American heartland in the summer of 2017 stretched out like a living canvas. Endless cornfields swayed in the warm breeze, their green stalks reaching toward a vast, indifferent sky. This was a landscape of quiet promise, sprawling university towns where the future was being written, one discovery at a time, in laboratories and lecture halls. For Yin Jiang, a 26-year-old visiting scholar from China, this new world felt like a thrilling adventure. Sometimes lonely, yes, but full of possibility. She had arrived at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in April, her brilliant mind ready to dive deep into the intricate world of photosynthesis and crop productivity. Yinjin was a star in her own right. Born in the city of Nanping in China's Fujian province, she was the pride of her working-class family. Her father, a truck driver, and her mother, a homemaker, had poured all their hopes and dreams into their bright, ambitious daughter. And he had never disappointed them. She'd graduated at the top of her class from Sun Yat-sen University, then earned her master's degree from the prestigious Peking University. But Yang Ying was more than just a scholar. She was a musician who played in a band, a young woman with quiet strength and a radiant smile that could light up any room. Her dream was simple yet profound: to become a professor in China, to return home and share all the knowledge she had gained. She was also deeply in love. Her boyfriend Xiaolin was waiting for her back home, and they had plans to marry in October. Life stretched ahead of them, bright with promise. Life in Urbana-Champaign felt like stepping into another world, so different from the bustling cities she knew. The campus was a sprawling oasis of brick and ivy, alive with intellectual energy and youthful dreams. Yanjing was one of over 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States, part of a generation that looked to America for opportunity and education. She threw herself into her research with dedication, but she also took time to explore her new surroundings. Her journal entries overflowed with observations about American life, each page a window into her curious, thoughtful mind. She was careful, too, always reassuring her family of her safety during their regular video calls. The afternoon of June 9th, 2017, was warm and humid, typical of an Illinois summer. Yinjing had an appointment to sign a lease for a new apartment. She was running late, just a small inconvenience in what should have been an ordinary day. At 1:39 p.m., she sent a quick text to the leasing agent, letting them know she'd be there around 2:10. She boarded a bus, got off to make her transfer, and then a simple mistake set in motion a chain of events that would lead to unthinkable tragedy. Standing on the wrong side of the street, she tried to flag down the next bus. But it drove past, the driver following company policy. Frustrated but not defeated, Yang Yang walked a few blocks to another bus stop on the corner of North Goodwin Avenue and West Clark Street. It was here, at 2 p.m., that a black Saturn Astra first passed her by. The car circled the block, then pulled up beside her a few minutes later. The driver, a young man with an unremarkable appearance, spoke to her for about a minute. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a simple act of kindness. A stranger offering a ride to someone in need. At 2:04 p.m., Yang Zhang, trusting and hopeful, got into that car. She was never seen alive again. As the afternoon light began to fade, unease settled over Yin Yang's friends like a heavy blanket. She was reliable, a woman of her word. Her failure to show up for the appointment, followed by complete silence, was completely out of character. By 9:24 p.m., worry had transformed into alarm. An associate professor called the police to report her missing. The search for Ying Zhang had begun. The first hours of any missing person case are a desperate race against time. The University of Illinois Police Department joined forces with Urbana Police to launch their investigation. The campus, usually a place of learning and friendship, suddenly became the center of a frantic search. The university's large Chinese student population mobilized immediately. Their shared language and cultural bonds became a powerful force in the effort to find one of their own. They organized search parties, printed and distributed flyers, and combed through every corner of campus and the surrounding areas. The first major breakthrough came from a surveillance camera. The grainy footage showed Yang in the bus stop, the black Saturn Astra, and that fateful moment when she climbed inside. The image was blurry, the license plate unreadable, but it was a start, a thread to follow. The FBI stepped in, bringing their expertise in digital forensics and large-scale investigations. They determined that 18 four-door Saturn Astras were registered in Champaign County. One by one, methodically, they began tracking them down. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, Yin Yang's family was living through their worst nightmare. The news of their daughter's disappearance hit like a devastating blow. Her father, Rongao Zhang, her aunt, and her boyfriend Xiaolin immediately flew to the United States, their hearts heavy with a fear they could barely put into words. They arrived in Champaign, this foreign land where their beloved daughter had simply vanished, and found themselves thrust into the heart of an unfolding investigation. The list of Saturn Astra owners led investigators to a 27-year-old man named Brent Christensen. He was a former PhD student in physics at the university, a man his professors described as quiet and unremarkable, with no history of disciplinary problems. On the surface, he seemed like an unlikely suspect. Married, a recent master's graduate, someone who appeared to be walking the conventional path toward a successful academic career. But when investigators first questioned Christensen on June 12th, something felt off. He was evasive, claiming he couldn't remember what he was doing the day Yin Yang disappeared. Maybe he was sleeping, he suggested, or playing video games. A few days later, his story shifted. This time, he admitted to giving a ride to an Asian woman, but insisted he'd dropped her off just a few blocks away after she panicked about taking a wrong turn. The investigators weren't buying it. They went back to the surveillance footage, this time studying every detail with fresh eyes. That's when they spotted it. The car in the video had a cracked hubcap and a sunroof. A quick visit to Christensen's apartment complex confirmed their growing suspicions. His black Saturn Astra had those exact same features. They had found their man. On June 15th, armed with a search warrant, investigators seized Christensen's car and electronic devices. What they discovered was telling. The passenger side of the vehicle had been cleaned with the kind of meticulous care that suggested someone desperately trying to hide evidence. But the digital trail they uncovered was even more chilling. In the months before Ying Ying's disappearance, Christensen had been visiting online forums with disturbing titles like Abduction 101 and Perfect Abduction Fantasy. The quiet, unremarkable PhD student had been harboring a dark and violent secret life. The FBI knew they had the right person, but they needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed a confession. Their strategy was both clever and bold. They approached Christensen's girlfriend, Tara Bullis. Unknown to most, Christensen and his wife were in an open marriage, and Bullis was his other romantic partner. FBI agents convinced her to wear a wire, to become an informant in the investigation of the very man she was dating. The recordings she captured were the stuff of nightmares. Christensen, believing he was confiding in someone he trusted, revealed the horrific truth of what he had done. He actually bragged about his crime, describing himself as a serial killer, and claiming Yang was his 13th victim, though investigators could never verify this disturbing boast. He described in chilling detail how he had brought Yang back to his apartment, held her against her will, and then assaulted and killed her. He spoke of how she had fought back with what he called supernatural strength. On June 29th, in a display of shocking arrogance, Christensen attended a campus vigil for Yang. With Bullis by his side, he walked among the grieving students and community members, even pointing out others in the crowd who fit what he called his ideal victim profile. The next day, June 30th, the FBI arrested Brent Christensen, charging him with the kidnapping and murder of Yin Zhan. The trial of Brent Christensen began in June 2019, in a federal courtroom in Peoria, Illinois. It was a case that had captivated two nations. The story of a promising young scholar whose American dream had become a horrific nightmare. The prosecution, led by the U.S. Attorney's Office, had a mountain of evidence. But they faced one significant challenge. Yin Ying's body had never been found. The trial opened with a stunning admission. In his opening statement, Christensen's defense attorney told the jury, Brent Christensen killed Yin Zhan. The defense wasn't contesting his guilt. They were fighting to save him from the death penalty. This trial, the attorney explained, was about why he killed her and what his punishment should be. The prosecution methodically built their case. They played the surveillance video of Yin Yang getting into Christensen's car. They presented evidence from his computer, his disturbing fascination with abduction and violence. And then they played the secret recordings. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Christensen's own voice filled the room, boasting about his crime in gruesome detail. He described how he had attacked and killed Yang before dismembering her body. Tara Bullis, the woman who had bravely worn the wire, took the stand to testify against her former boyfriend. She recounted how he had confessed to her, how he had shown no remorse, only a chilling pride in his actions. The jury also heard from another young woman who'd had a terrifying encounter with Christensen on the very same day he abducted Yin. She testified that he had approached her, posing as an undercover police officer, trying to lure her into his car. She had refused, a decision that likely saved her life. The most emotional moments of the trial came when Yin Ying's family testified. Her father spoke through a translator, his voice heavy with grief. He described his daughter's dreams, her bright future, and the devastating impact of her loss on their family. Her boyfriend, Salan Ho, spoke tenderly of their plans to marry, of a future that had been cruelly stolen from them. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on 1 count of kidnapping resulting in death, and 2 counts of making false statements to the FBI. The first phase of the trial was over. Now the same jury would decide whether Brent Christensen would live or die. The sentencing phase unfolded as a somber and emotionally charged affair. The prosecution argued forcefully for the death penalty, describing Christensen's crime as heinous, cruel, and depraved. They painted a chilling picture of a man who had meticulously planned and executed a brutal murder, a man who had shown no remorse and had even taken pleasure in his horrific actions. The defense, in a desperate bid to save their client's life, presented a starkly different picture. They argued that Christensen was a man struggling with mental illness, alcohol abuse, and a failing marriage. They brought in his father, who tearfully described his son as a gentle, logical person who had never shown any signs of aggression. They presented a 72-page PowerPoint presentation, arguing that a life sentence in maximum security prison was sufficiently harsh punishment. In-Ying's family also had their say. Her father, in a powerful and heartbreaking statement, pleaded with the jury to sentence Christensen to death. But he also made another, more desperate plea. "We hope that every day he is in prison, he will feel the pain and suffering that we feel for the loss of In-Yang," he said. More than anything, he wanted to know where his daughter's body was, so they could bring her home to China for a proper burial. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days. The decision they faced weighed heavily on them all. In the end, they could not reach a unanimous verdict on the death penalty. 10 jurors voted for death, but 2 held out. Under federal law, a unanimous decision is required for a death sentence. As a result, Brent Christensen was automatically sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On July 18, 2019, Judge James Shedd formally sentenced Christensen. He castigated him for his inexplicable act of violence, for satisfying his self-absorbed and selfish fantasies. Christensen himself remained silent, showing no emotion as his fate was sealed. The verdict was a bitter pill for In-Ying's family, and for many in China who had followed the case closely. The idea that a confessed killer could be spared the death penalty was difficult for many to comprehend. But for the family, the most agonizing part of their ordeal remained unresolved: the location of In-Ying's remains. Following the trial, under an immunity agreement, Christensen's lawyers revealed what he had done with In-Ying's body. He had dismembered her remains, placed them in 3 separate garbage bags, and thrown them in a dumpster outside his apartment. The contents of that dumpster had been taken to a private landfill, compacted multiple times, and buried under 30 feet of garbage. The chance of recovering her remains was virtually zero. The case of In-Yang Zhang left an indelible scar on the University of Illinois and the Chinese-American community. It was a story that highlighted the vulnerability of international students, the clash of cultural and legal systems, and the unfathomable depths of human cruelty. In the wake of this tragedy, the university installed more security cameras and created an endowment to support international students in crisis. For her family, the pain remains a constant companion. They returned to China without their daughter, their grief compounded by the knowledge that they will never be able to give her a proper burial. Her story has been told in a documentary, Finding In-Ying, a testament to her family's love and their tireless search for justice. The case of In-Yang Zhang is a reminder of the fragility of life, the darkness that can lurk beneath the most ordinary of surfaces, and the enduring power of a family's love in the face of unimaginable loss. Story 18. The name Chakra Khalili once sparkled with a kind of luminous, old-world glamour that felt almost mythical in India's rapidly changing landscape of the 1980s. Here was a woman born into privilege, beauty, and immense wealth. The granddaughter of Sir Mesa Ismail, the legendary Dewan of the princely states of Mysore, Jaipur, and Hyderabad. Her life unfolded like a rich tapestry, woven with threads of Persian aristocracy and Indian royalty, a legacy that carried both the weight of history and the glitter of high society. She was a mother of 4 daughters, a philanthropist, and a shrewd real estate developer, a woman who moved with effortless grace through the corridors of power and influence. But in 1991, that brilliant light was suddenly snuffed out. Chakra Khalili, then 43, vanished from her palatial home at 81 Richmond Road in the heart of Bangalore. She left behind a silence so profound it would take 3 years to break, and a story so dark it would forever haunt the nation's conscience. The mystery didn't begin with a bang, but with a slow, creeping dread. It started in the worried heart of her second daughter, Sabah, living abroad. Sabah had grown used to her mother's vibrant, if sometimes unpredictable, presence in her life. But in the spring of 1991, the phone calls stopped. The letters ceased. There was only an unsettling void. When Sabah called the sprawling Bangalore mansion, it was always her mother's second husband who answered. His name was Murali Manohar Mishra, a man who called himself Swami Shraddhananda. His explanations for Chakra's absence were as varied as they were vague. She was on a long holiday, he would say, seeking peace and solitude. She was expecting the son he had promised her and had gone into seclusion. She had renounced the world and was on a spiritual quest. He was a master of deflection, a calm, reassuring voice on the other end of the line, painting pictures of a woman who had simply chosen to step away from the world. For a time, the stories worked. Chakra was a free spirit, known for her impulsive nature. But as months bled into a year, and then two, the excuses began to fray, revealing the sinister pattern beneath. Sabah's unease hardened into suspicion. She knew, with a daughter's unshakable intuition, that something was terribly wrong. Her mother hadn't just left, she'd been erased. To understand the tragedy of Chakra Kalili, one must first understand the world she came from. Born Chakra Namazi in 1947, she was heir to two powerful families. Her paternal grandfather was a wealthy trader with vast real estate holdings across Asia. Her maternal grandfather, Sir Mirza Ismail, was one of the most respected administrators in pre-independence India, a visionary who helped shape modern Mysore. She grew up in a world of casual opulence, dividing her time between Singapore and India. Educated, cultured, destined for a life of influence. In 1965, at the age of 18, she entered into what seemed like a destined marriage. She wed her first cousin, Akbar Mirza Khalili, a handsome, brilliant diplomat in the Indian Foreign Service. Their union was a merger of dynasties, a continuation of their shared aristocratic lineage. For 2 decades, Chakra played the diplomat's wife to perfection. She raised their 4 daughters, Zabanisa, Sabah, Rehana, and Esmat, across the globe, in postings from Paris to Amman to Tehran. She was a gracious hostess, a devoted mother, and a striking presence at her husband's side. But beneath the polished exterior, a restlessness grew. The confines of her role began to chafe. While Akbar was posted in Iran during the tumultuous Islamic Revolution, Chakra moved back to Bangalore and discovered a passion and a talent for business. Following in her ancestors' footsteps, she dove into real estate, developing family properties with a sharp and decisive hand. The experience ignited a sense of independence and ambition that could no longer be contained within the traditional boundaries of her marriage. In 1985, after 21 years and 4 children, Chakra and Akbar Khalili divorced. It was a move that shocked their social circle, a bold declaration of her intent to live life on her own terms. She was a woman of immense means, now untethered from convention, charting her own course. It was this very freedom that would make her vulnerable to the predator who was already circling. He entered her life not as a suitor, but as a savior. Murali Manohar Mishra was a man from a world away. With no formal education and a murky past, he had reinvented himself as Swami Shraddhananda, a self-styled godman who claimed to possess mystical powers. They had first met in 1982, when he was introduced to both Chakra and Akbar Khalili in Delhi Darchai. He was charismatic and cunning, a man who knew how to listen, how to identify a person's deepest insecurities and desires, and how to present himself as the solution. For Chakra, a woman who had everything, there were still unspoken longings. She was navigating a series of complex and contentious property disputes, and she desperately wanted a son, an heir to carry on the family name. Shroud Hananda preyed on both vulnerabilities with surgical precision. He offered her guidance through her legal troubles, his unwavering confidence becoming a soothing balm for her anxieties. And he promised her the one thing her first marriage had never given her, a male child. Slowly, he became her confidant, her advisor, her guru. Her family watched in growing horror as his influence took hold. To them, he was nothing more than a parasite, latching onto her wealth while systematically isolating her from everyone who truly loved her. But Chakra was completely enthralled. She didn't see a charlatan. She saw a man of profound spiritual power who understood her in ways no one else ever had. 6 months after her divorce, in April 1986, she made the decision that would seal her fate. She married him. The ceremony was a quiet, subdued affair, a stark contrast to the grandeur of her first wedding. It marked a complete break from her past. She gave Shrinananda access to her finances, and by 1987, he had convinced her to grant him power of attorney over her vast property portfolio, worth crores of rupees. Gradually, he began controlling every aspect of her life. He filtered her phone calls, managed her appointments, and slowly, methodically severed the connections between her and her daughters, her mother. What had once been a source of comfort for Chakra became a relationship filled with growing tension. They argued constantly over his increasing control and her unwavering devotion to her children. Children he saw as nothing more than rivals for her fortune. The grand house on Richmond Road, once a proud symbol of her independence, was transforming into her gilded cage. The official investigation began not with dramatic fanfare, but with quiet desperation. In 1992, after enduring a full year of being stonewalled by Shredach Hananda, Saba Khalili filed a habeas corpus petition at the Ashok Nagar police station in Bangalore, demanding that authorities produce her mother. But Shratnandanda was a master of deception. He continued weaving his intricate web of lies, calmly assuring police that his wife was alive and well, just traveling, he claimed. He remained composed, cooperative, and utterly convincing. For 3 long years, he held the authorities at bay, living in obscene luxury within Shaker's mansion, while the woman who paid for it all had simply vanished. He became a grotesque parody of the Lord of the Manor. He threw lavish parties, his laughter echoing through halls where Shaker's presence had faded to nothing more than a distant memory. He entertained guests in the beautifully manicured gardens, the very ground beneath their feet holding the most terrible of secrets. In the most literal sense, he was dancing on her grave. But Saba remained relentless. She refused to let the case grow cold. Her persistent pressure, combined with a routine reinvestigation of unsolved cases by Bangalore police, finally broke the stalemate in 1994. Now deeply suspicious, police devised a sting operation. They focused their attention on the household staff, particularly a man named Raju. Under mounting pressure, the nervous servant finally cracked. He confessed that he had witnessed something that had haunted him for 3 torturous years. He told police about a large pit that had been dug in the courtyard, and a heavy wooden box that had been buried deep within it. This confession became the key that unlocked everything. Armed with a court order and a team of laborers, police descended upon 81 Richmond Road in May 1994. The operation was grim and methodical. They began digging in the paved courtyard directly behind the master bedroom. The air grew thick with tension. As shovels bed into the earth, they soon struck something hard. Wood. Slowly, carefully, they unearthed a large coffin-like wooden box fitted with wheels. A senior police officer pried open the lid. The stench of decay hit them immediately, overwhelming and unmistakable. Inside, resting on a decaying mattress, lay the skeletal remains of a human being. As the forensics team carefully examined the scene, They made a discovery that sent chills through even the most hardened officers. One of the skeleton's hands was found clutching the mattress beneath it. This was the final, horrifying proof. Shaker Kali had been buried alive. The entire exhumation was captured on video, marking a landmark moment in Indian forensics. DNA tests, another first for the Indian judicial system, confirmed that the skeleton was indeed that of the missing heiress. The 3-year mystery was finally over. The search for Shakra Kali had ended in the backyard, her own home. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Shraddhanandanda's carefully maintained facade as a serene spiritual guru finally crumbled completely. He confessed. His account, delivered with chilling emotional detachment, revealed a crime of breathtaking premeditation and cruelty. The motive was brutally simple: greed. He wanted her property, all of it, and he saw her daughters as obstacles to his total control. She had to be eliminated. His plan was diabolical in its meticulous detail. He hired casual laborers to dig a deep rectangular pit in the courtyard, telling them it was for a septic tank or to store valuables. He then commissioned a carpenter to build a large wooden box, claiming it was needed to ship furniture or antiques overseas. On the morning of April 28, 1991, he set his deadly plan in motion. He quietly laced Shaker's morning tea with a powerful sedative. Once she had fallen unconscious, he carefully placed her into the box he'd already positioned in the pit. Then he sealed the lid and covered the pit with earth, leaving his wife trapped beneath the ground. He was soon taken into custody, and a long, grueling legal battle began. The trial, which started in late 1997, held the entire nation spellbound. It was a saga of fallen aristocracy, spiritual deception, and calculated murder. In May 2005, a civil sessions court found him guilty and sentenced him to death by hanging, declaring it among the rarest of rare cases. The judge spoke of the diabolical nature of the crime and the fear it had spread throughout the community. No mitigating circumstances could warrant a lesser punishment. The Karnataka High Court upheld the death sentence later that year, but the story took one final, shocking turn. In 2008, Shraddhananda appealed to the Supreme Court of India in a decision that left the legal community and Shaker's family utterly stunned. The court commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment. However, they added one crucial condition. He would remain behind bars for the rest of his natural life, with absolutely no possibility of remission, furlough, or parole. Today, Murali Manohar Mishra, now in his 80s, remains locked away in a prison in Sagar, Madhya Pradesh. Over the years, he's made countless attempts to seek parole, pointing to his advanced age and what he claims is good behavior in prison, where he's reportedly earned Best Inmate awards. Each and every request has been firmly denied, most recently in October 2024, with the court standing firm on their original mandate of lifelong imprisonment. The house on Richmond Road, where this terrible crime unfolded, still stands today. It's become a crumbling monument to a vibrant life cut tragically short. The case of Shaker Kali remains a chilling chapter in the history of Indian crime. A haunting story of love and betrayal, of a princess and a predator, and of a man who celebrated over the grave of the woman he had sworn to love. A woman he had instead left buried in the cold, dark earth, all for the love of her money. Story 9. The end of summer in Cumberland Beach, Ontario, always carried its own special kind of magic. Golden light slanted through the trees, and the last traces of warmth lingered in the air before autumn's crisp bite would settle in. During that Labor Day weekend of 1990, the magic felt especially strong. This small resort town along Lake Cochin hummed with the lazy, contented energy of vacationers savoring their final holiday moments. For 13-year-old Leah Sua, the weekend sparkled with promise. High school was just days away, a thrilling new chapter about to unfold. She stood on the edge of everything, a bright, joyful girl with endless possibilities stretching before her. But in the deep, silent hours of Saturday, September 1st, something terrible and ancient shattered that perfect summer peace. It didn't arrive with thunder or fanfare. Instead, it came with the quiet, deliberate sound of breaking glass. Like a phantom had moved through the modest house on Beachview Avenue, a presence of pure evil leaving devastation in its wake. By the time Saturday's sun cast its warm, indifferent light across Cumberland Beach's peaceful lawns, Leah's world of possibilities had been snuffed out forever. Summer's magic had twisted into a nightmare that would haunt her family and the entire town for years to come. The day before had been perfectly ordinary, filled with the gentle rhythms of family life. Leah, her 36-year-old single mother Laura, and her 9-month-old baby brother Michael had just returned from visiting Laura's sister. Their house buzzed with the familiar chaos of unpacking and settling back home. Leah was everything a 13-year-old should be, full of life and laughter. A dedicated student, a loyal friend, and an adoring big sister. She'd spent that evening with a friend, their conversation likely bubbling with the excited chatter of teenage girls about to start high school. That night, instead of sleeping in her own room, she drifted off on the living room couch, lulled by the house's familiar, comforting sounds. In the master bedroom, Laura slept beside her infant son, wrapped in the deep, exhausted rest that only single mothers know. The house lay quiet, a perfect picture of domestic peace. The first hint of horror came as a sound that likely never reached their sleeping minds, the sharp crack of glass breaking at the back of the house. An intruder had shattered a window pane on the rear door, reached inside, and unlocked it. He stepped into their quiet home, a shadow carrying an incomprehensible capacity for violence. Police would later believe he was driven by twisted, sadistic urges. This was a man for whom causing pain was an end in itself. He moved first toward the master bedroom. Laura Sua, peaceful in sleep, became his first victim. He raised a heavy metal object. Investigators would later guess it might have been a pipe, crowbar, or tire iron, and brought it down on her head with brutal force. Again and again he struck, the sickening sounds echoing through the silent house like some grotesque percussion. In his crib nearby, baby Michael remained untouched, a silent, unknowing witness to his mother's attack. Leaving Laura for dead, the attacker turned his attention to the living room. Leah, asleep on the couch, now faced his depraved fury. He assaulted her in ways too terrible to fully describe. But his cruelty wasn't finished. He dragged her, likely barely conscious, from the couch, down 3 steps and out into the cool night air of the backyard. There, on the damp grass, he continued his frenzied attack with the same metal weapon he'd used on her mother, beating her until her young life slipped away. Then he vanished back into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would forever scar this small town's soul. The next morning, the sun rose on a world completely unaware of the horror that had unfolded on Beachview Avenue. A neighborhood friend of Leah's, a young girl whose name has been kept private, began her day with the simple, innocent plan of seeing her best friend. She called the Sua house several times. No answer. A prickle of worry, that sense when something just isn't right, prompted her to hop on her bicycle and ride over. She knocked on the front door, her calls echoing into the unsettling silence within. Still nothing. Following a path around the side of the house, she walked into the backyard. In that instant, her childhood innocence shattered forever. There, sprawled on grass that was trampled and stained dark, was her friend Leah's lifeless body. She had been so savagely beaten that she was barely recognizable. The girl's screams brought the horror into daylight. The Ontario Provincial Police arrived to find a scene of almost unimaginable brutality. The home was splattered with evidence of the violent struggle that had taken place. There, on a living room floor, clinging to life by the most fragile thread imaginable, they discovered Laura Souza. She had endured severe head injuries, her face and skull badly damaged. Yet somehow, against all odds, she was still breathing. They found the phone on the ground nearby, shattered and stained with blood. A heartbreaking sign that she had desperately tried to call for help. Laura was rushed to a Toronto hospital, where she would remain for the next 3 weeks under constant police protection. Authorities feared her attacker might return to finish what he'd started. She would survive, but the woman who eventually walked out of that hospital was forever changed. A shadow of who she once was. The physical damage was devastating. Surgeons needed metal plates to rebuild her skull and right cheek. She was left with lasting vision and hearing problems. But the cruelest blow of all was what the attack had stolen from her mind. The brutal assault had completely erased her memory of that terrible night. She couldn't remember the attack. She had no recollection of the man who murdered her daughter and left her to die. She was the only witness, yet the killer's identity remained locked away in a corner of her mind she could never reach. The investigation into Leah's murder became the largest in op history. Detectives faced a crime of shocking brutality and a maddening lack of evidence. The killer had brought his weapon and taken it with him when he left. The crime scene told a bloody story, but in a cruel twist of forensic fate, the attacker had left none of his own DNA behind. No blood, no hair, nothing. The only real clue was a single bloody shoe print found inside the house. Forensic experts identified it as a size 9 or 10 Nike leather court shoe, a common brand and size that barely narrowed their search. The investigation became a massive undertaking. Over the years, police conducted more than 1,500 interviews, chasing down thousands of tips. They canvassed the neighborhood and set up highway billboards featuring Leah's smiling face with the haunting question, "Do you know who killed Leah Souza?" They offered a $50,000 reward for information and arrested several people over the years, but no one was ever charged. The case's most agonizing puzzle was Laura herself. She held the key, the one person who had seen the killer's face. Investigators tried everything to unlock her memories. She underwent hypnosis and was given sodium pentothal, the so-called truth serum. But the trauma had sealed that door in her mind, and it remained stubbornly, heartbreakingly shut. Her frustration was overwhelming. The constant, tormenting knowledge that the answer to her daughter's murder was trapped inside her own head, just beyond her grasp. Police theories shifted over time. Initially, they believed the attacker knew the family, that Laura was the real target, and something had gone wrong, turning the killer's attention to Leah. Laura's brother, Carlos Souza, first shared this belief, telling reporters he thought it was someone Leah knew. But he later changed his mind, pointing to signs of forced entry as evidence of a stranger attack. A criminal profiler brought in by the op painted a chilling picture of the killer, a troubled, sadistic individual, likely rejected by women and driven by twisted needs. The profile described a man hiding in plain sight, a monster living among them. As years stretched into decades, a dark shadow began looming over the investigation. His name was Brian Timothy Elson. Just 4 months after Leah's murder, in January 1991, Elson stabbed and killed another teenage girl, 17-year-old Sandra Bannister. The crime was brutal, yet he served only 6 years in prison. What made Elson a compelling suspect in the Souza case was a chilling coincidence. His grandmother lived just down the street from the Souza family in Cumberland Beach. Police came to believe Elson was in town the night Leah was murdered. He fit the profiler's description perfectly, a sexually motivated, sadistic killer. Over the years, he was questioned numerous times and even arrested in connection with the Souza case, though never charged. In 2010, the investigative program WA5 tracked Elson down to the nearby town of Aurelia, where he was living quietly after his prison release. A reporter confronted him on camera, asking directly about his involvement in Leah's murder. He denied it, his face showing practiced indifference. But the cloud of suspicion hanging over him remained dark and heavy. Was he the man who slipped into the Souza home that night? Was he the monster who had escaped justice for so long? Without a confession or definitive forensic evidence, the question remains unanswered. Another ghost in a case full of them. The murder of Leah Souza left a deep and permanent scar on her family and the community. The little house on Beachview Avenue, once the scene of such unspeakable tragedy, was eventually repossessed and sold at a devastating loss. Laura Souza found herself forced to rebuild her entire life from the scattered pieces of a nightmare that had stolen her daughter and erased her memory. She devoted herself to raising her son Michael, the baby who had somehow slept peacefully through that terrible night. Yet, even in her happiest moments with him, joy remained forever shadowed by the deep, endless grief that comes to a mother who has lost a child and can never remember why. The case remains open to this day. A thick, dust-covered file sits in the op offices, a silent testament to a crime that has stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. This is a story of a young life cut tragically short, of a mother's endless torment, of a community forever haunted by the chilling knowledge that a killer had walked among them, only to vanish like a phantom into the darkness. The question of who killed Leah Souza still lingers in the air around Cumberland Beach, a cold, unanswered whisper carried on the wind that blows in off the lake. The tragic legacy of a summer that ended in heartbreak and sorrow. Story 10. The man who called himself Malcolm Webster was a chameleon, a creature born of smoke and mirrors. To the world, he wore a mask of quiet competence and gentle charm. As a nurse, he carried himself with the kind of trustworthy warmth that his profession demanded. His voice was soft and measured. His face could break into the most reassuring smile, and he possessed an almost supernatural ability to make women feel truly seen, deeply cherished, and completely safe. But beneath this carefully crafted exterior lurked something far more sinister. Malcolm Webster was hollow inside, a void filled only with greed and an endless hunger for admiration. He was a predator who had perfected the art of deception, and his most dangerous weapon was the trust he cultivated so expertly. His story didn't begin in darkness, but in a life of relative privilege. Born in 1959, he was the son of a high-ranking detective chief superintendent with London's Metropolitan Police, a man who had actually headed the fraud squad. It was the kind of background that should have instilled honor and integrity, but something in Malcolm had gone fundamentally wrong. Even as a child, the warning signs were there. He had a disturbing fascination with starting fires, earning him the nickname Pyro among those who knew him. He would fake illnesses with startling conviction, a manipulative skill he would later perfect into something deadly. At 15, he left school without a single qualification, becoming a blank canvas on which he would paint his own twisted masterpiece. His early years were a patchwork of odd jobs: bin man, driver, office clerk, before he discovered nursing. The profession was perfect for him. It gave him access to the most vulnerable people, and more importantly, to the tools that controlled life and death itself. In his teens, he began his lifelong affair with deception, telling anyone who would listen that he had cancer. It was a lie he would return to again and again, like a dark rehearsal for the grand performances yet to come. The first glimpse of his true nature emerged in the sun-scorched landscape of Abu Dhabi. At 30, Webster was working in the children's ward at Tawam Hospital. Within just 6 months, a terrible shadow fell over his section. 3 children, all under the age of 6, died suddenly from cardiac failure. It was an unusual and deeply suspicious pattern. An internal investigation began immediately. Supervisors discovered that Webster had been injecting himself with insulin, and a horrifying possibility took shape. Had he used the same method to murder those innocent children? But in a culture that discouraged post-mortems and favored swift burials, there simply wasn't enough evidence for a police investigation. His father, the powerful policeman, allegedly pulled strings to get his son out of the country. The incident was quietly buried, becoming another secret swallowed by the desert sands. Webster had walked away, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and devastated families. His capacity for evil had been tested and confirmed. He returned to the United Kingdom as a man with a dark past and an insatiable appetite for what he believed the world owed him. He drifted from one relationship to another, systematically targeting wealthy women to fund his lifestyle. "Why work hard yourself when someone could be doing it for you?" became his favorite saying, a twisted mantra that guided his parasitic existence. He was a master manipulator who could summon tears as easily as turning on a faucet whenever difficult questions arose. And in 1993, his path crossed with Claire Morris-Daughter. She was 32 years old, from Old Meldrum in Aberdeenshire. Intelligent, kind-hearted, and financially secure. Claire thought Malcolm Webster was the man she'd been waiting for her entire life. He seemed charming, attentive, and genuinely devoted to her. They married on September 3rd, 1993, and with that ceremony, Claire unknowingly stepped into a web of lies that would ultimately destroy her. The marriage began with something far more sinister than ordinary marital problems. Webster, drawing on his nursing knowledge, began systematically drugging Claire with temazepam, a powerful sedative. The medication made her drowsy, confused, and increasingly dependent on him for everything. She confided in a friend, another nurse named Sarah Dock, about a strange car accident that had happened just a few months into their marriage. Webster had been driving when their car somehow ended up in a ditch. It was a warning sign, a tremor before the earthquake, but its true significance would only become clear through the devastating lens of hindsight. May 27, 1994, was the day Malcolm Webster decided to collect on his investment. His plan was as brutal as it was simple. He drugged Claire into unconsciousness and carefully placed her in the passenger seat of his Daihatsu 4x44. Then he drove to a remote stretch of the Auchenweave to Tarves Road in Aberdeenshire. There was no crash. No swerving to avoid a phantom motorcyclist, as he would later claim to investigators. He simply pulled the car over, positioned it near a tree, and with his helpless wife trapped inside, set the entire vehicle ablaze. As flames began consuming the car, a retired police officer happened upon the scene and stopped to help. Webster, playing the role of the distraught husband to perfection, calmly and repeatedly insisted that there was no one else in the vehicle. He stood there and watched as the car was engulfed in a roaring fireball. The evidence of his crime reduced to nothing but ash and twisted metal. The immediate aftermath became a masterclass in deception. Webster spent a week in the hospital, insisting he'd been injured in the crash. But extensive tests told a different story. He was perfectly healthy. His pulse, his heart rate, everything was completely normal. At Claire's funeral, he appeared wearing a neck brace, just another prop in his tragic performance. He clasped the hand of Claire's grieving brother, Peter Morris, his face carved into a mask of sorrow, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I was holding the hand of her murderer," Peter would later recall with a shudder. That firm, insincere grip became a source of enduring torment. Despite Webster's convincing act, some weren't buying it. Derek MacDonald, a fireman at the scene, thought the whole thing seemed off. The car showed no signs of violent impact. For a car to be stopped or parked and burst into flames, that just doesn't happen. Not unless it's in the movies, he later said. A police officer investigating the case in his own time was troubled by the same glaring inconsistencies. The slow speed of the vehicle, the complete lack of skid marks, And that simple, horrifying question. Why hadn't Claire been able to escape? But at the time, these doubts weren't enough. The official cause of death was ruled an accident, and Malcolm Webster, the grieving widower, collected over €200,000 in life insurance payouts. He used the money to buy a Range Rover, a yacht, and to continue his predatory pursuit of unsuspecting women. Shortly after Claire's death, Webster began a relationship with Geraldine Oakley, a computer manager at the hospital where he worked. The relationship was kept secret, but Oakley grew suspicious. Webster kept asking her the same unsettling question: if a second autopsy was likely to be performed on Claire. The question was odd, insistent, and it planted a seed of doubt that wouldn't stop growing. Twice she went to the hospital's consultant pathologist to voice her concerns. But each time, she stopped at the last minute, unable to put into words the terrible suspicion taking hold of her. In 1995, Webster moved to Saudi Arabia, and his web of deceit expanded. He began a telephone relationship with a woman named Brenda Grant. When they finally met, he repeatedly offered her drugs. She refused, a decision she would later realize had likely saved her life. Their relationship overlapped with another. Years later, in 2005, he contacted her out of the blue, claiming he had leukemia and arranging a trip to Paris. He was a man who juggled lives and lies with chilling, effortless skill. In 1997, on the other side of the world, Webster found his next target. Felicity Drum was an oncology nurse from New Zealand. They married, and she gave birth to a son. Once again, the pattern began repeating itself. But this time, the victim would fight back. The first signs of trouble were subtle. On their honeymoon, after drinking a cup of tea Webster had given her, Felicity slept for 36 hours straight. On another occasion, she slept for 18 hours. She began experiencing double vision, and a blood test revealed troubling abnormalities with her liver. He was drugging her, just as he had drugged Claire. Then came the fires. During their marriage, Webster caused 3 separate house fires, including one at Felicity's parents' house. In each case, he played the hero, the one who discovered the blaze and raised the alarm. It was a classic pattern, a desperate craving for attention and control. His lies escalated. He told Felicity he'd had a heart attack. He told her he had cancer. He made endless excuses about his finances, claiming his money from Scotland was tied up and hadn't yet been transferred to their joint account in New Zealand. He had 9 insurance policies on her life, totaling €750,000. The final deadline to make a payment on a house they were buying was February 12, 1999. On that day, they were driving to the bank. Webster was behind the wheel. Suddenly, he claimed there was something wrong with the steering. The car swerved violently across 2 lanes of traffic and back again. But when Felicity, in a surge of adrenaline, grabbed the steering wheel, she found it worked perfectly. The car ended up in a ditch, a chilling echo of the accident he had staged with Claire years before. What happened next saved her life. Webster immediately got out and went to the boot. He screamed at her to stay in the car, his voice laced with terrifying urgency. But Felicity refused. She got out, her mind racing, the pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to click into place. She called her lawyer to drive her to the bank. Webster, his plan thwarted, resorted to his old tricks. He feigned a heart attack and was taken to the hospital. While he was there, Felicity went to the bank alone. The truth she uncovered was devastating. He had systematically drained $140,000 from her bank account. The man she had married, the father of her child, was a complete fraud. When she later confronted him, he admitted his plan to kill her with a chilling offhand remark: "You would have died happy." The New Zealand police issued 4 warrants for his arrest on charges of arson, administering harmful substances, and attempting to harm his wife. But by then, Malcolm Webster had already vanished, slipping away from the country and leaving behind a devastating trail of shattered lives. He made his way back to the UK, and by 2002, he had drawn another unsuspecting woman into his web, Christina Willis. The pattern unfolded with chilling familiarity. He borrowed her money with no intention of paying it back, spun tales of having cancer, and convinced her to draft a will naming him as beneficiary, even securing power of attorney. Everything pointed to her becoming his next victim, but for reasons that remain a mystery, their relationship came to an end. It's believed he had spotted a far more promising target, a wealthy woman named Simone Banerjee. Simone was accomplished and independent, with a deep love for sailing. Webster launched into his most brazen performance yet, telling her he was dying of terminal leukemia. To sell the lie completely, he even shaved off his head and eyebrows. Simone believed every word. She rewrote her will, leaving everything to him. They made plans to marry, a bigamous union that would hand him complete control over her fortune. And he had plans for her too. Later, Simone would make a terrifying discovery. Someone had deliberately punctured the foil on her life jacket. I had pretty much no doubt that the boat was the way it was going to go, she would later say. The horrifying realization washing over her that he intended to drown her, staging yet another tragic accident. But Webster's carefully crafted world was about to crumble. The catalyst came from an unexpected source, a chance conversation. Felicity Drum's sister happened to speak with a British police officer, sharing her family's growing suspicions about her brother-in-law. That single conversation ignited interest, and the wheels of a massive international investigation began to turn. In 2008, Grampian Police in Scotland launched Operation Field, a comprehensive re-examination of Claire Morris's death. Meanwhile, New Zealand authorities reopened their investigation into the attempted murder of Felicity Drum. Investigators began the painstaking work of piecing together Malcolm Webster's life, a journey that would span continents and uncover more than a decade of lies. They interviewed over 1,000 people, slowly but methodically untangling the intricate web of deceit he had woven. The net finally closed in 2009. Webster was arrested and charged with murdering Claire Morris, attempting to murder Felicity Drum, and trying to marry Simone Banerjee to gain access to her estate. Police delivered an Osmond warning to Simone, a formal notice of credible threat to her life, revealing that her fiancé was not only a fraud, but also a married man with a son and a dark, violent history. At first, she dismissed it as nonsense, a testament to the sheer power of his manipulation. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her world shattered. Malcolm Webster's trial began on February 1st, 2011, at the High Court in Glasgow. It would become the longest criminal trial involving a single defendant in Scottish legal history, a marathon of evidence and testimony that exposed the chilling depths of his cruelty. The prosecution, led by Advocate Depute Derek Ogg QC, painted the picture of what he called a most cruel, practiced deceiver, a man who, if convicted, would rank among the most notorious murderers of modern times. They presented a mountain of evidence, the result of a vast and meticulous investigation that had harnessed advances in forensic toxicology, accounting, and crash investigation techniques to uncover truths buried for far too long. The defense, led by Edgar Prey QC, faced an almost impossible task. They admitted Webster was a liar, a thief, a philanderer, and what they called a ratbag, but they insisted he was not a killer. Webster himself maintained his innocence, clinging to his story that Claire's death was nothing more than a tragic accident. But the evidence told a different story entirely. The jury, 9 women and 6 men, listened for 50 days as the prosecution built its case. They heard from Felicity Drum, who recounted the drugging, the fires, and that terrifying car crash. They heard from Simone Banerjee, who spoke of his leukemia lies and the punctured life jacket. They heard from a parade of other women who had been deceived and defrauded by him. And they heard the cold, hard facts of forensic evidence, which proved that Claire Morris had been drugged and that the fire that killed her had been deliberately set. On May 19th, 2011, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Malcolm Webster guilty of murder and attempted murder. He sat motionless in the dock, his face betraying no emotion as the verdicts rang out. The mask of the charming, gentle nurse had finally been stripped away, revealing the monster that lurked beneath. On July 5th, 2011, he was sentenced. Judge Lord Bannatyne described his crimes as cold-blooded, brutal, and callous, committed purely for financial gain. He sentenced Webster to life in prison with a minimum term of 30 years. In the aftermath, the full scope of his evil continued to emerge. Claire's family fought to have the inscription on her headstone changed, to remove his name and the loving words he had chosen for the woman he had murdered. Her brother Peter found the original inscription deeply offensive, arguing that the marriage was designed towards murder. After a long and determined battle, the council finally agreed. Malcolm Webster would be forever banned from being laid to rest beside his first victim. Webster's life behind bars has become nothing more than a pitiful footnote to his reign of terror. Other inmates have turned on him, attacking him repeatedly. Reports suggest he even hired a convicted child molester for his own protection. Appeal after appeal has crumbled in his hands, his desperate claims of innocence echoing through empty courtrooms where no one believes him anymore. This man who once lived in a world of elaborate make-believe, who played the devoted husband and dying patient with such bone-chilling skill, had become just another prisoner. As one observer put it, he was now simply really boring. The Malcolm Webster case offers us a haunting glimpse into the dark heart of psychopathy. This is the story of a man who looked at other human beings and saw not people to love and treasure, but merely resources to drain dry. When they had nothing left to give, he simply threw them away. It's a story about the quiet, creeping horror that can lurk behind the most charming smile. But it's also about the remarkable courage of the women who survived his web of lies and refused to give up their fight for justice. Above all, this is a story about a family's unbreakable love for their daughter and sister. A love so fierce and enduring that it would never rest until the truth about her murder was finally dragged into the light. Story 11. Deep in the heart of the Chigaku Mountains, nestled within the emerald folds of Okama Prefecture, sat the quiet village of Kumo. This was a world unto itself, a place where life moved to the ancient rhythm of changing seasons and time-honored traditions that held the community together like invisible threads. The 1930s found Imperial Japan racing toward war daughter. Cities pulsed with industrial machinery and nationalist fervor. But here in Kumo, life remained a gentle tapestry woven from rice paddies, silk farming, and the intimate, sometimes stifling, closeness of neighbors who knew every secret. Among the village's oldest and most hidden customs was something called Jilbi, night crawling. Born from the practical needs of rural life, this secretive ritual allowed young unmarried men to slip into women's homes under cover of darkness, seeking intimate connection. It was a delicate dance of silent consent and shared secrets, a way for young hearts to navigate desire within a society bound by rigid social rules. In this world of whispered invitations and shadowed encounters, a young man named Matsuo Toi would come of age. And it was the corruption of this very tradition that would plant the seeds of monstrous revenge. Matsuo Toi entered the world on March 5, 1917, his life marked by tragedy from the very beginning. His parents, once prosperous, fell victim to tuberculosis, that white plague casting its fearful shadow across Japan. Matsuo and his older sister were left orphans while still mere infants. Their grandmother took them in, raising them within Kumo's tight-knit embrace. Throughout his childhood, Matsuo shone brightly, an outgoing boy, a natural leader among his friends. But everything changed when he turned 17 and his sister married, leaving the village behind. A crushing sense of abandonment took hold. The once sociable boy began turning inward, becoming increasingly withdrawn and isolated from the world around him. As a young man, Toy discovered a fleeting sense of belonging through the practice of yubing. His nightly ventures brought success, his youthful confidence becoming a kind of currency in the village's secret world of intimacy. For a precious time, he belonged. He was a player in the game, but this fragile connection was about to shatter completely. In May of 1937, Toy received a devastating diagnosis: tuberculosis. In an era before effective treatments, this wasn't just a death sentence for his body. It was social suicide. The disease struck fear into every heart, bringing shame and stigma that could transform someone into an outcast overnight. The news spread through the small village like poison in a well. Doors that had once opened to him in darkness now remained firmly barred. Women who had once welcomed his advances now recoiled in terror, their fear of contagion overwhelming any affection they might have felt. He was no longer desirable. He had become contamination itself, a walking specter of death. The rejection was absolute, humiliating. Toy's already shrinking world collapsed into a spiral of bitterness and rage. Consumed by a sense of injustice, his loneliness began festering into potent hatred for the community that had cast him aside. His fragile mind sought comfort in dark fantasies of retribution. He became obsessed with the sensational story of Sada Abib, a geisha who, in 1936, had taken violent revenge on her lover in a shocking act that captivated the entire nation. This tale of obsessive passion and brutal vengeance resonated deeply with Toy's growing sense of powerlessness and his hunger for violent reckoning. He poured his twisted thoughts onto paper, attempting to write a novel. But his real story was being plotted in the darkest corners of his mind. He was no longer just a social outcast. He was becoming the architect of massacre. The final trigger came when local authorities, troubled by his increasingly erratic behavior, revoked his hunting license and confiscated his legally owned firearm. It was an unforgivable insult, final confirmation of his powerlessness. If they wouldn't allow him legitimate power, he would seize it through terror. Toy began preparing for his personal war. He secretly acquired a Browning shotgun, an arsenal of ammunition, a razor-sharp katana, and a woodsman's axe. He carefully modified the shotgun and practiced his aim with methodical precision. He was no longer just fantasizing, he was rehearsing. His final notes, written in the days before his planned attack, reveal a mind steeped in chillingly clear logic. He wrote of his anger toward villagers who had scorned him, of his deep resentment against the women who had rejected him. With methodical precision, he listed the names of those he intended to kill and those he would spare. His criteria formed a twisted calculation of perceived slights and imagined loyalties. He even expressed regret that he couldn't eliminate everyone on his list, as doing so would mean harming those he still considered innocent. In one of the most disturbing revelations, he laid bare his decision to take his own grandmother's life. He wrote that he simply couldn't bear the thought of leaving her behind to endure the crushing shame and social disgrace of being known as the killer's grandmother. In his twisted reasoning, this would be an act of mercy, a final, warped gesture of devotion before he brought devastation upon the village. The night of May 20th, 1938, settled over Ko with an eerie, unsettling quiet. As villagers retreated to their homes for the evening, an unnatural darkness began to fall. Matsuo Toy moved like a shadow through the paths he knew so well, scaling utility poles and cutting the power lines. The entire community plunged into a blackness as complete as the rage that consumed him. The stage was now set. Around 1:30 in the morning on May 21st, his dark performance began. Toy transformed himself into something nightmarish. He wrapped a hachimaki, a traditional Japanese headband around his forehead, securing two powerful flashlights to it. Their beams sliced through the darkness like glowing, monstrous eyes. Armed with his shotgun, his gleaming katana, and a heavy axe, he was no longer the sickly outcast the village had rejected. He had become a specter of vengeance, the embodiment of their darkest fears made real. His first act of violence struck at his own blood. He slipped into the room where his 76-year-old grandmother lay peacefully sleeping, and with one terrible swing of his axe, ended her life. With that moment, his last connection to humanity was severed forever. Now he was free to become the monster he had envisioned. He stepped into the night and began his methodical reign of terror. Moving from house to house with calculated purpose and burning fury, he knew every corner of the village intimately, the location of each home where every family slept. This wasn't random violence. He was a reaper working from a list. The night erupted with the thunderous roar of his shotgun and the screams of his victims. He burst into homes, the twin beams of his headlamps catching families frozen in their beds, their faces illuminated in those final, terrifying moments. He shot, he struck, he moved with chilling efficiency, driven by a year of festering hatred. In just 90 minutes, Matsuo Toi tore through the village, leaving behind unimaginable devastation. He attacked 11 households, taking the lives of 29 neighbors. Some homes lost entire families. Others were left with only a single, traumatized survivor. The community of Kamo, home to 111 souls, was utterly shattered. Nearly a third of its residents had perished in one horrific night. As the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, casting pale gray light across the blood-soaked village, Toi's rampage finally ended. His thirst for revenge was satisfied. Covered in the evidence of his monstrous work, he made his way to a neighbor's house. The grandfather and grandson inside, who had been spared his wrath, watched in stunned silence as the blood-spattered killer entered their home. But Toi didn't want another victim. He wanted pencil and paper. He sat down and calmly wrote his final notes, adding details to his manifesto of madness. Then he walked into the nearby hills to a spot overlooking the devastation he had created. There, as the morning sun rose, Matsuo Toi placed the muzzle of his Browning shotgun against his chest and pulled the trigger, bringing his reign of terror to a violent, solitary end. The aftermath of the Tsurayama incident was a scene of almost indescribable horror. The surviving villagers emerged from their homes to find their world transformed into a house of horrors. News of the massacre sent shockwaves through Japan, a horrifying anomaly in a nation that prided itself on social order and harmony. But the story, sensational as it was, soon disappeared from the national press. Some believe the wartime government, eager to maintain an image of national unity and strength, actively buried the story. They were unwilling to let a narrative of societal breakdown and local authority failure take hold. The village of Kamo was broken beyond repair. The survivors faced immense grief and trauma, but their suffering didn't end there. In the cruel logic of the aftermath, the families Toi had spared found themselves viewed with suspicion by their neighbors. Perhaps, people whispered, they had somehow been connected to the killer. The very act of surviving made them outcasts. With so few people left, life in the farming community became incredibly difficult. Before long, most survivors abandoned the region, leaving behind the blood-stained land. Speaking of the massacre became a local taboo, a wound too deep to ever be discussed aloud. It wasn't until after World War II ended that the story of the Tsurayama incident emerged again into the national consciousness. It became a dark legend, a chilling piece of Japanese folklore that has inspired books and films. Today, the Tsurayama incident remains the deadliest mass attack by a lone gunman in Japanese history. It stands as a chilling reminder of what happens when social rejection and bitter resentment are left to fester and grow. This was long before the internet existed, before certain terms had even entered our vocabulary. Yet Matsuotoi became a dark harbinger of something we'd see again and again, a twisted form of rage born from loneliness and frustration. Here was a man who felt cast aside by the world around him, and in his pain, he chose to strike back with devastating consequences. His violent spree through the peaceful hills of Okayama would prove to be a haunting glimpse into the future. A preview of the kind of senseless violence that would resurface time and again in the decades to come. It serves as a sobering truth that sometimes the most horrific acts of cruelty can spring from something as fundamentally human as the agony of isolation. The simple, crushing pain of being forgotten and left alone in the darkness. Story 12. The air in Jackson Township, Ohio, carried a bitter metallic bite on the night of January 9th, 2017. This was the kind of cold that crept through even the heaviest coats, settling deep into your bones. The kind of cold that made the world feel hostile and unforgiving. Snow had been drifting down all evening. Fine, wind-driven powder that clung to bare tree branches and dusted the asphalt of the strip mall parking lot on Portage Street. Inside Ang's Asian Cuisine, the dinner rush had finally wound down. The clatter of plates and conversation gave way to the quieter sounds of cleanup. The warm scent of soy sauce and fried ginger still lingered in the air, like an echo of the evening's business. It was in this peaceful moment, just after 9:30 p.m., that everything began to unravel. One small thread pulled loose, and a family's carefully woven life started coming apart at the seams. The voice on the 911 call belonged to a man, tight with nerves that made his words shake around the edges. "Jackson Township Police," the dispatcher answered, her tone steady and practiced. "Yes, I need some help," the man stammered. "Okay, where are you at?" 4924 Portage Street, he said, giving the restaurant's address. I can't find my daughter." The man identified himself as Lang Xiao, co-owner of Ang's Asian Cuisine. His daughter was Ashley. She had just turned 5 years old. The last time he'd seen her was that afternoon, maybe around 40 or 50 p.m. In the background, a woman's voice could be heard, thin and sharp, calling out corrections about the timeline. The dispatcher, patient but persistent, tried to nail down exactly when Ashley had gone missing. 5 hours. A 5-year-old had been missing for 5 whole hours. Lang's story spilled out in a frantic rush. Ashley had been tired, he explained. She'd fallen asleep in a back room of the restaurant while the family worked. He had left to pick up their older daughter, Jojo, from school. When he returned with his wife and Jojo, they'd all seen Ashley still sleeping peacefully in that back room. Then the dinner service kicked into high gear. Everything became a blur of taking orders, cooking, and serving customers. When the rush finally died down and they began cleaning up, they went to check on Ashley. The room was empty. She was gone. "Do you think she could have woken up and run out somewhere?" the dispatcher asked, her voice a steady anchor in Lang's rising panic. "I have no idea," he said. "She was sleeping in the back. There were no other employees," he confirmed. "Just him and his wife, Mingchen. No security cameras either. They'd been in business for 6 years and had never needed them." He insisted there had been no suspicious customers, nothing out of the ordinary. The story was simple, terrifying, and entirely believable. A little girl, waking up confused in the back of a busy restaurant, had somehow wandered out the back door and into the dangerous, freezing Ohio night. Less than 3 minutes into the call, the dispatcher's voice cut through Lang's frantic explanations. "All right, my officer's outside if you want to go and meet my officer at the door." "He's here right now?" Lang asked, a new note of alarm creeping into his voice, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to hold more than just surprise. "Yeah, he's already outside." The line went quiet. Outside, the flashing lights of a Jackson Township police cruiser painted the falling snow in strobing blues and reds. It was the first sign that the quiet rhythm of this suburban town was about to be shattered forever. The search for Ashley Shao had begun. The response came swift and organized. A 5-year-old girl dressed only in a purple winter coat and gray leggings was lost somewhere in the freezing darkness. The stakes couldn't be higher. The first officer on scene met with a distraught Len Shao and began searching the immediate area. The restaurant's back door opened onto a small service alley, and beyond that stretched dense woods filled with thick brush and pockets of standing water. It was treacherous terrain for a small child, especially in a blizzard with almost zero visibility. Word spread like wildfire. Soon, that single police cruiser was joined by others. The Jackson Township Fire Department arrived, deploying thermal imaging cameras and drones to scan the frozen woods from above, their humming blades cutting through the silent snowfall. The Ohio Attorney General's office issued a statewide missing child alert, and Ashley's smiling face, a picture of pure innocence, began flashing across television screens and social media feeds. The community, jolted from its winter quiet, responded with an outpouring of concern. Strangers bundled up against the bitter wind began gathering near the restaurant, their faces etched with worry. Douglas Panarella, who worked across the street and was a regular at Ang's, vowed to conduct his own search after work, a sentiment echoed by dozens of others who felt that primal parental fear of a lost child. As the hours stretched on, the search grew more intense. The FBI and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation were called in, bringing with them a higher level of expertise and resources. The search spread outward from the restaurant like ripples in dark water, a widening circle where hope and dread walked hand in hand. Investigators moved on foot through the bitter cold, their breath forming ghostly clouds as they combed the woods. Flashlight beams sliced through the darkness, creating dancing patterns among the trees. K-9 units pressed their noses to the snow-dusted undergrowth, while their handlers called Ashley's name into the silent night. But as this massive search unfolded under the harsh glare of news cameras, something quieter was happening inside the restaurant itself. Investigators, trained to see what others missed, began picking up on small, troubling details. Liang Xiao and Ming Chen appeared distressed, yes, but there was something strangely passive about them. They chose not to make a personal plea to the media, something most parents do instinctively when their child goes missing. Their story stayed consistent, but it had an odd, rehearsed quality, like lines they'd both memorized from the same script. The most unsettling detail, though, was what wasn't there at all: witnesses. In a busy strip mall on a Monday evening, not a single person had seen a small girl in a purple coat walk out of that restaurant. The thought began taking root in investigators' minds. What if Ashley had never left the building? They started viewing the restaurant not just as where the search began, but as a potential crime scene. A second, more careful examination of the premises began. Every cupboard, every closet, every walk-in cooler. They checked inside appliances, behind supply stacks, in any space where a small child might crawl. The atmosphere inside Ang's Asian cuisine grew heavy with unspoken suspicion, a stark contrast to the desperate hope still flickering outside. The search party pushed through the brutal weather all night and into Tuesday, January 10th. The community held vigils, leaving stuffed animals, flowers, and cards in a growing memorial by the restaurant's front door. But inside, the focus had sharpened to a razor's edge. Investigators were re-examining the kitchen, that realm of stainless steel and controlled chaos. Above the large walk-in freezer, they noticed a small crawl space. Dark, seemingly empty, easily missed. Just big enough for a child to squeeze into. An investigator hoisted himself up and peered into the shadows. There, pushed deep into the recess, sat a large plastic container filled with white crystalline substance that looked like salt. And then he saw it, poking out from the salt, small and pale and terribly still. A child's hand. The frantic, hopeful search for a missing girl was over. The heartbreaking investigation into her murder had just begun. Ashley Xiao had been there all along, hidden within the walls of her own family's restaurant, just feet away from her parents as they served customers and lied to police. To understand the darkness that descended on that cold January night, we must travel back from that Ohio strip mall to the lives Ming Chen and Liang Xiao had built, and the pressures that had been quietly eating away at their foundation for years. Their story was, in many ways, a fractured version of the American dream. Liang Xiao had arrived from China in the late 1990s, settling in New York City. He worked relentlessly, navigating the maze of immigration and labor until he secured his U.S. citizenship. His family already had roots in the restaurant business, having run the Lucky Star restaurant for 11 years in the very same location that would later become Ang's. Liang was ambitious, a man chasing his vision of prosperity. Ming Chen's journey proved far more dangerous. In August 2008, as a teenager, she embarked on a secret odyssey from China to America. She paid a human smuggler a staggering $20,000 to guide her across the border. Her path led through Mexico, where she was hidden in a vehicle and driven into the United States. She made her way to Ohio, where an uncle lived. A year later, in 2009, she applied for asylum, claiming religious persecution. She told authorities she practiced Falun Gong, a spiritual practice banned and brutally suppressed by the Chinese government. She painted a picture of being arrested in a raid in April 2008, detained for a month, and physically punished until she signed a statement renouncing her faith. But the immigration judge found her testimony inconsistent and not credible. Her asylum request was denied, and she was ordered deported. This triggered a years-long legal battle, a cloud of uncertainty that hung over her as she tried to build a new life. It was during this period of legal limbo that she met Liang Xiao. They married in March 2010. 7 months later, their first daughter, Jojo, was born. The following year, in summer 2011, they took the leap and opened their own restaurant, Ang's Asian Cuisine. They were the entire staff, a 2-person operation pouring every ounce of their energy into the business. The restaurant was thriving beyond their wildest dreams. Locals couldn't stop raving about the fresh food, lightning-fast service, and the genuinely warm atmosphere this devoted couple had created. Then, in December 2011, their second daughter Ashley came into the world. Suddenly, they found themselves caught in an impossible juggling act, running an all-consuming business 6 days a week while caring for 2 little ones. The restaurant devoured their lives, swallowing up every precious moment. The choice they made broke their hearts. They sent both Ashley and Jojo to live with their grandparents in New York. It was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to catch their breath and get back on solid ground. But those temporary weeks stretched into 2 painfully long years. When the girls finally came home to Ohio in October 2015, everything had changed. Ashley had spent most of her young life with her grandparents. Now she was a toddler facing what felt like strangers. She struggled with the transition, acting out and pushing boundaries. Potty training became a daily battle. Even at nearly 5 years old, accidents still happened, a source of mounting frustration for her mother. For Ming, already stretched to her breaking point by the restaurant's relentless demands, dealing with this challenging child felt overwhelming. The pressure kept building from every direction. Money troubles persisted despite their success. Their marriage began showing cracks. Ming would later claim that Lang turned violent, taking his own frustrations out on her. The restaurant became their entire universe. The girls spent countless hours behind the cash register or tucked away in the back room. Their childhood played out in the shadow of kitchen heat and dinner rush chaos. While Ming saw Ashley as a difficult child, customers remembered something completely different. A bright, social little girl who'd light up the room with her infectious smile. This was a family drowning under invisible pressure, like a pressure cooker with the heat slowly rising, day after day. The final, devastating explosion was inevitable. The autopsy revealed the investigators' worst nightmare. Ashley Xiao had died from severe injuries to her head and body. Her small frame told a heartbreaking story of violence. The news hit the community like a thunderbolt. A makeshift memorial bloomed outside the restaurant, a silent, gut-wrenching tribute to a life stolen far too soon. Candlelight vigils flickered against the darkness of this unthinkable crime. Friends and customers struggled to make sense of it all. How could the friendly couple who served them meals be accused of something so horrific? Ming Chun and Liang Xiao were arrested and charged. Ming faced murder and assault charges. Liang was charged with complicity in both crimes. The judge set bond at a staggering $5 million each, noting Ming's immigration status and the serious flight risk they posed. Separated into different interrogation rooms, their carefully crafted lies began falling apart. When investigators told Ming about Ashley's death, her reaction was chilling. No tears, no shock, no visible grief whatsoever. Her expression remained eerily flat and disconnected. Instead, she complained about her life, the restaurant stress, her difficult in-laws. "I only have 2 hands," she said, her voice completely empty of emotion. "I'm not a superhuman girl." She painted herself as the victim, crushed by circumstances beyond her control. When the interrogator finally pressed about what happened to Ashley, her answer was bone-chillingly direct. "How'd she die?" he asked. "I kill her," Ming replied, her voice flat as stone. "You killed her?" "Yeah." "How did you kill her?" "Just kill her," she said, refusing to give details. "Just kill her and then she'd die." She admitted to striking her daughter. When asked about the body, her response was equally cold. "I told my husband to take care of it," she said, "and I don't know how he took care of it." She confessed to the murder but placed all responsibility for the cover-up on Leon. In the other room, Liang Xiao clung to the missing child story for nearly an hour. He had no idea his wife had already confessed everything. But as investigators dismantled his timeline piece by piece, pointing out every contradiction and impossibility, his resolve crumbled. The elaborate web of lies he'd spun became his prison. Finally, he broke completely. The truth, when it emerged, was even more horrific than investigators had feared. The murder hadn't happened at the restaurant at all. It had taken place at their apartment on Monday morning, January 9th, before the 911 call, before the frantic search, before the crocodile tears. "My wife was very angry with Ashley," Li Nang explained, his voice thick with defeat, "because she had an accident in her diaper." It was the same potty training frustration he'd mentioned before, but this time, it had spiraled completely out of control. In a moment of uncontrolled fury, Ming grabbed her daughter and struck her head against the carpeted floor twice. Lang witnessed everything that happened next. Ashley lay still on the floor afterward, struggling to breathe. A green fluid began flowing from her mouth. Lang rushed her to the bathroom, desperately attempting CPR, but it was already too late. Her heart had stopped. Their daughter was gone, taken by her own mother's hand. Terror consumed them both. "We were both afraid," Leon later confessed. "We were both afraid what's going to happen if we called." They couldn't bear the thought of losing everything. The restaurant, their other daughter, their entire life in America. So they made a terrible pact. They would never call the authorities. Instead, they would make it look like she had simply vanished. Their plan was as chilling as it was desperate. They placed Ashley's body in her car seat and drove to the restaurant. There, they laid her in the back room, planning for her older sister Jojo to discover her when she returned from school. They hoped to convince the 6-year-old that Ashley was merely sleeping. Jojo's innocent testimony that Ashley had been at the restaurant would become the foundation of their deception. For the remainder of that day, with their daughter's body lying in the back room, Ming Chun and Leon Xiao continued their routine. They cooked, cleaned, and served customers, a haunting mockery of normal life. After Jojo had seen Ashley sleeping, Lang moved the body. He placed his daughter's small form into a plastic restaurant bin and concealed it in the crawl space above the walk-in freezer. Then they waited for darkness to fall before making that fateful 911 call. Lang later admitted they had no plan beyond that moment. They assumed police would conduct a quick search and move on. He had considered various ways to dispose of the body later, but they never imagined the massive response that would follow. The FBI, the BCI, the drones, hundreds of volunteers searching tirelessly. If we knew that there was going to be like 100 people searching for her, I don't even know, he trailed off, his voice heavy with hollow regret. I am so sorry. The confessions revealed the devastating truth, but the legal proceedings were only beginning. As the community mourned, justice slowly moved forward. A custody hearing determined that Jojo, the silent, innocent witness to her family's destruction, would be placed with Stark County Job and Family Services. She was eventually allowed to live with relatives in New York, where her sister Ashley was finally laid to rest. In the months that followed, Ming and Lang's legal strategies took different paths. In a dramatic September court appearance, Lin Xiao accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to obstructing justice, corpse abuse, tampering with evidence, and endangering children. In exchange for a reduced sentence of 12 years in prison, he agreed to testify against his wife, the mother of his children. Ming, meanwhile, tried to change her story. She told a psychologist that Leon was the one who had killed Ashley, claiming he had forced her to take the blame, by promising that if she confessed, he could get out of jail to care for Jojo. It was a final, desperate attempt to shift responsibility. But facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of her husband's testimony, she too eventually accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, endangering children, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. She received 22 years in prison. Upon completing her sentence, she will be deported back to China, the very country she had paid so dearly to escape. The case of Ashley Xiao tells a story of immense, layered tragedy. It's the story of a little girl remembered for her bright smile, killed by the person who should have been her greatest protector. It's the story of a family that collapsed under the crushing weight of cultural displacement, financial pressure, and deep psychological turmoil. It's the story of an American dream that twisted into a uniquely American nightmare, playing out in the back rooms of a suburban Chinese restaurant. There was no monster lurking in the shadows to snatch a child in the night. The monster was already inside the house, born of desperation, frustration, and a rage that finally, irreversibly erupted. The community was left to mourn a child they had come to know, and to wonder how such darkness could have grown unseen beneath the bright, welcoming light of Ang's Asian cuisine.